welcome to this special town council meeting on February 28th, 2024. This is primarily for us to discuss the development of the fiscal year 2025 budget for the town of Garrett Park. Are there any changes to the agenda that anyone needs to make? If not, we will consider them approved as presented. Town Manager Matthews, will you please kick us off?
Will do. So I'm just going to make some brief comments and then just turn it over to you all for discussion, because that's really what tonight is about. You may have your kind of own objectives, but I guess what I was hoping to accomplish tonight is to share information on some preliminary revenue outlook items. Have you all discuss the funding request of the town committees, and if you're so inclined to provide direction to staff on that.
Could you put that on, what's it called, like slideshow?
Sure.
It's a bit
Bigger, you're
a
right.
bit bigger.
Okay. Let's see. There you go. I think you'll probably want to spend some time this evening talking about the capital budget and discussing what projects you want to fund. Also included in your agenda packet, as you know, is a very rough draft of a capital improvement program document. I'd like to get some feedback. There are certainly a number of entries that are missing in that. And then if you're so inclined, it would be helpful to at least get preliminary direction on the real and personal property tax rates. So I think it's very easy to kind of view a budget as a bunch of numbers, but when you kind of strip all that away, what it really represents is what your priorities are for the community for the upcoming fiscal year. As you all know, you had a special town council meeting retreat on October 31st, at which you discussed your shared vision for the town and your priorities for the next 1 to 2 years. Listed on the slide are the priorities that you agreed upon at that meeting in October. In no particular order, it was to complete the town hall renovation, create a long-term capital plan that addressed both maintenance items as well as amenities that you wanted to see for the community, evaluate the structure of town committees, update the town charter and the town code, renovate or redesign Cambria Park and the open space near the pool property, establish a system for communication with the town council and residents, and complete the Waverly sidewalk projects. Obviously, some of these items are really just more a matter of your time and staff's. Others have actual fiscal implications. So just wanted to talk a few minutes just about kind of the revenue outlook for FY 2025. Unlike a lot of states, there are very limited ways for municipalities in Maryland to actually generate revenue. The revenues that we bring in must support both the day-to-day operations of the town as well as fund capital improvements. The only exception on the capital side is if we're successful in getting any project-specific state or federal grants. So like most municipalities in Maryland, our primary revenue sources are real property tax revenue and income tax receipts. Obviously, it varies from year to year, but combined, these are probably over 60% of our revenues just between these two sources. So our real property tax base, all town property was reassessed in calendar year 2023. In accordance with Maryland law, any increase in market value is phased in over the next 3 tax years, and FY 2025 will mark the first year of that phase-in period. So every year on Valentine's Day, don't ask me why that's the date they pick, but the Maryland Department, I know, I think it's someone's actual humor. The Maryland Department of Assessments and Taxation will issue what is referred to as the constant yield tax rate certification. As part of that, there's a number of pieces of information, but one of which is assessment data as of July 1st, the preceding year, and then what they are anticipating for July 1st of the existing year. So they provided information both of our assessed values as of July 1st of 2023, as well as what they're projecting for July 1st of 2024. Our net assessable real property base is projected to increase by $9.6 million or 3.12% from the prior year. I think most of you likely recall this, but our local tax rate for FY 2024, and it's been at this rate for some years, is
And my question is, how, has it ever been increased and when? And
I'd have to, it was actually, Phil, who is my historian, might be able to answer this better than I can. Yeah.
okay,
Do you remember, Phil, when that change occurred? I think it was sometime in the last 10 years.
Yeah, it's like 5, 8 years ago, maybe
Yeah.
something like that. It was a while. It was a while. We brought it up by a penny.
Yeah, and
by what?
A penny.
A penny, okay,
yeah, if that's a,
It
right,
was from like 19.
That
Right.
sounds like Peter. That sounds like-
Just for the uninitiated, these increases in rates are not inflation adjusted at
No.
all. Okay.
no, so a municipality sets its tax rate. And this might answer part of your question, Todd. So for FY 2025, every year, as I mentioned, the Maryland Department of Assessments and Taxation, and its relevance has sort of changed due to legislation that was enacted last year. But they calculate what is referred to as the constant yield tax rate. And what that basically does is it gives you the rate that the local government would set if it wanted to keep its revenues flat. So what you're seeing on this screen is our FY 2024 local tax rate was 0.2045 or
Mhm.
per $100 of assessed valuation. The state, based on their projection of net assessable base, calculated the constant yield tax rate at 0.1983. So what that basically is saying is that even though we're keeping the tax rate, well, that's your decision, but if you were to keep the tax rate flat, the town would still gain additional revenue just through increased assessments.
and the
Okay.
people's tax bill would go down a little bit,
It would be
if I'm
flat.
understanding.
If the rate stays the same, people's tax bills will go up.
Right, but,
Through
but
assessable
the
base.
equal amount is a smaller
Right, it would go
reduction,
down.
then it would go down if we wanted to keep it the same.
Right, the tax rate would go
That's
down.
depending on your assessment too. I mean, if you get
It
rid-
does, yeah, because the assessment isn't
Wow.
necessary. I mean, I think Garrett Park, unlike a lot of communities, I think assessments, I can't speak to every single person in town, but as an inner ring suburb, a very desirable community, property values tend to continue to escalate, whereas when
Mhm.
the housing market collapsed
Right,
back in the late
2008,
yeah, especially outer ring suburbs, a lot of, I know like, I wasn't in Carroll County at the time. But Westminster, where I later worked, lost an incredible amount of assessed value. And I think some of the municipalities in Prince George's County, I understand, lost about almost a third.
and we also
They're
have
accessible.
smaller houses getting knocked down and bigger houses getting
Right.
built, which increase the valuation, the tax valuation.
So the
Assess-
3% is attributable to this, to increase value of housing
Right.
across the board.
Yeah,
And if we leave it the same,
we get more money.
0.2 of a penny per $100 of assessed value, we get more money.
Yeah,
20 cents per.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, if we leave it at-
20%,
yeah.
20 cents.
Yeah, so what the constant yield, I mean, we've been exempt because, like I say, there was a change in state law in the last legislative session. For larger municipalities who have a larger assessable base, what the state used to require you to do is even if you exceeded the constant yield tax rate, they required a publication process. So part of it was the state law required you to essentially disclose that by keeping your tax rate the same, you were still picking up money.
So we have to disclose that.
We actually, because the amount, like in recent years, the amount that we picked up, if you will, by increased assessments fell below 25,000 and the state basically considered you exempt. State legislature changed some things last year. Basically, if we keep our rate the same, there is no exemption process anymore, but if your rate stays the same, even if it exceeds the constant yield tax rate, you no longer have to advertise, which kind of
Okay.
surprised me when I found that out.
Because I was used to the other thing. It's just-
Right.
I asked you that question.
Yeah.
We're gonna have.
We don't,
We don't.
So it's
Yeah.
politically costless,
yes,
but we're not supposed to say that to our public who may be watching.
Well, that being said, I think what we only gained
we don't gain that much.
11
Yeah.
out or something.
It's a
Right,
little,
and I think in effect, we will be advertising it because it will be a matter of the public record.
It
is.
Oh, yeah.
The increase.
right.
And people will want to know.
Right, and
There's a whole fire
Yeah,
deal you used to go through, as I recall.
there was you had to advertise, there were very specific advertising dates and a newspaper of general circulation.
So if we had a pie chart
Mhm.
of the entire budget, the entire revenue, the revenue side, what percentage would this property tax be? 70%?
Real property tax? Oh, no, it's
Yeah.
not that high.
Oh, it's not.
No,
What else accounts for it?
really the two drivers of our operations, are gonna be, revenues from real property taxes and income tax receipts.
Oh, income tax.
Yeah, those are the two drivers.
Oh, that's right. We have
Yeah.
income tax. Okay. That's right. Okay, sorry.
No, that's fine. That's why we're having this, is just to talk about it. So as I mentioned, local income taxes, generally, it's the second largest revenue source with everything that's gone kind of haywire with, post-pandemic filings. It's actually kind of moved into the lead lately.
Okay, sorry.
But just for anyone who happens to be watching, so counties under Maryland law can assess their own income tax rate. The maximum that you can assess under state law, if you're a county, is 3.2%, which is what many of them do.
What's the number?
3.2%.
That's higher than ours.
We can't actually assess an income tax. This is actually the county income tax.
Okay,
By state law, a municipality receives 17% of the income tax generated by the county's 3.2% tax in Montgomery County's case. This has been as we've talked about, even under the best of times, it is a difficult revenue source to accurately project.
right.
I know when I first came to Maryland, I was trying to figure out what was going on with Tacoma Parks. And the county actually had an economist who certainly looked at, economic trends. But I know he spent a lot of time looking at income taxes because it was such a significant portion of the county revenue stream. The pandemic has certainly complicated that, as we've talked about numerous times during my tenure here. I'm sorry.
It's okay. I just want to make sure that our connection didn't go out.
No, I think.
I don't think so.
Okay, sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, so as we have talked about before, filing deadlines got extended during the pandemic with no penalty, so many people took advantage of that. The state essentially suspended compliance efforts with income tax collections during the pandemic. They have obviously since resumed that. But what the combination of these factors have done is it really has skewed a lot of the income tax stream. People are filing later, so it's hitting a different fiscal year. With the deadlines being extended, if you're someone, who has a lot of capital gains or something, one basically return can really skew some things.
Sorry, when it says Garrett Park receives, is it 1.7%?
It's 17%
We receive 17%.
of what the county picks up from its 3.2%.
So 17% of what Garrett Park residents contribute to.
Oh, I'm sorry.
To the
Okay.
county, right.
Accountants.
Okay.
And this is all driven, it's all mandated by state law.
I'll just throw a plug in for the moment, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Tell your friends to make sure they check the box for Garrett Park.
I have been trying to do that in the Bugle and actually gave people the code, because if the political subdivision code is not listed,
Yep.
Garrett Park does not benefit from the
In the
filing,
tax file.
in the tax filing. Yeah, we lose
Political
revenue.
subdivision code?
Yeah, so what I have in the Bugle is there's actually a political subdivision code. If you look at when you're filing your state income taxes, there is a list of political subdivision codes that indicate where you live.
Okay.
So I tried to
Sometimes
be,
it's a municipality, other times it's like a special tax and
Right.
like Bethesda.
yeah,
So they
but
can't do it by your mailing address
no, they will
1604.
not.
or your PO box?
If you don't sign it, they
Right.
don't give it.
You're
Right.
right. So basically what I've been
Yeah.
trying to do in the Bugle is actually have like a little
Right.
screenshot of that section of your
Right,
Maryland income tax form and basically tell people how to fill it out.
right.
I may do a GPML or town forum blast now that
that'd be a good
people
idea.
are also
And
starting
put
to
a
file.
sign up in the post office.
Yeah, that might be a good idea.
Yeah,
So just to give you an idea of kind of how screwy things have been, or generally are with income taxes. So I have a spreadsheet where I've gone back and sort of looked at just what we have brought in monthly, historically, going back as far as, well, more recently FY 2019 to FY 2022. During that time period, our receipts have ranged anywhere from 467,000 roughly to about 514,000. FY 2023, we brought in almost $640,000. So far.
it's a big
above
increase.
yeah. And I think a lot of that's because there were reconciling payments from prior tax years. As we talked about a couple months ago, we got a massive payment in November, which was also part of that was a reconciling payment from a prior tax year. But year to date through January, we've already brought in $480,000. So that's actually almost equal to what we have brought in historically. Typically we get sizable payments for looking from here to the remainder of the year. For February, May, and June, we generally get nothing or very little in March, 0 in April. So I should get a notification from the state tomorrow saying what the payment was for the month of February.
I want to point out that we are at 94% of what we budgeted. We were expecting for this fiscal year to get just another $30,000.
Yeah, and,
So
and
we're
typically
probably-
in February, the payment's roughly about 100, ranging in the $100,000 range. So at this point, to be honest, I need the February returns to come in, need to spend a little, well, not a little, probably a lot more time sort of analyzing what has really happened the last couple of years and how much of that was reconciling payments to try to give you a good sense of where we'll be for FY 2025. I do think that the filing deadline extensions have now passed. So I think we'll start in FY 25, starting to see something more mirroring what we had prior to FY 23 and 24. I think those are aberrations. A couple other things, highway user revenue, we talked a little bit about this at your meeting in February. So the state multiple times during the year will send out their estimates both for the current fiscal year and the upcoming fiscal year. They did that in January. So they are projecting for FY 2025 that will bring, get roughly $68,000. That would be about a $9,100 increase on what they're estimating for this year. As we talked about at your meeting in February, highway user revenues are heavily restricted by state law. State law actually prescribes how those funds can be used. Generally, if you're not running transit systems and things like that, you can use it to make debt service payments if you're doing road projects, which I don't see us doing. But outside of that, sidewalk construction, road repaving, if you're a growing municipality where you're building roads, you can use it. Those are the most common uses of highway user revenue.
How about the aprons for the driveways that people want us to pay?
I think
for?
those would be considered more private use. I think if you're constructing driveway aprons because you're doing a sidewalk, then it's considered part of the sidewalk project. But I think the reimbursements we make would be considered sort of a private program benefit.
So,
It's pretty low too, right?
Yeah, it's about $2,900. So yeah.
so this highway fund, this revenue projection, this is Garrett Park tax money.
It's the Garrett Park's allocation because they look at
Of the
vehicle registrations. It's based on vehicle registrations, which are tracked by jurisdiction. So it is important that
All right.
residents sort of use the right, designation of where they live. And then it's also based on your lane miles.
Okay.
So I think you all might recall, so we do get a payment from Montgomery County. It's referred to as a municipal tax duplication payment. In Maryland, I won't bore you with the whole history of it, but there are shall counties, which means they have to do certain things, and there's may counties when it comes to tax duplication. Montgomery County is a shall county, which means they are required to basically at least confer with municipalities about tax duplication. It's been a controversial issue during my entire 20 years in Maryland in terms of what's a fair payment for what. We don't know what the payment will be. I mean, I have a rough idea based on legislation that was passed by the county council in 2022. But basically you learn what your payment's likely to be when the county executive releases his budget on March 15th. We currently receive one tax duplication payment. It is for road maintenance. You might recall that I have been attempting to get a payment for park maintenance. Much to my chagrin, we once again have been denied. And the reason for this is that the original designation of municipalities who got a park maintenance payment, that was determined back in the 1980s. And Tacoma Park was one of those who was designated. What they have done since that time, and I think it was like the mid-80s, is they've just applied an inflationary factor. At this point, no one really knows what the underlying basis or formula was back from the 80s. When Ike Leggett was county executive and I was in Tacoma Park at the time, I served on a task force that he appointed, which was a bunch of municipal staff members as well as county staff members, to talk about not only tax duplication, that was the primary discussion point, but also other revenue kind of sharing issues. The parties kind of hit an impasse at certain points, but the one thing that most of us agreed on was a methodology to calculate the park maintenance payment. Now, when I left to work up in Carroll County, I gave my entire box of tax duplication stuff to a colleague. That was a number of years ago. And so we had come up with a formula that everyone could live with. The staff members that are still at the county, I reached out to them. I reached out to other municipal representatives to say, since the county executive's office candidly and OMB at the county don't seem to know what to do with this issue, to see if anyone had that report, that draft report. I've got a version of it on my home computer because I had done some work on it at the time. But what I don't have is the addendum that had the formula.
But they haven't adopted anything.
They hadn't
No,
adopted
so
it, but I think
they're
it
in the
provided a path
process.
forward. Well, I think what's happened though, I've not heard anything from Ken Hartman.
Nor have I checked in on it. So I
Yeah.
was I don't even know if it was last week or the week before. Time doesn't mean much to me right now, but I actually was at a dinner with the county executive and department and
Well, Maryland Municipal League chapter.
yeah, who's our former senator? His name just left me. No, state senator.
Oh,
Senator? Hey, Steve.
no, it's not.
No. But the former state senator who is now right-hand person for the county executive. Anyway, so I did talk to them and I will raise this again tomorrow at the mayor's conference. But we're supposed to put together a task force so we can solve this.
Yeah.
And one of the first things on the list is, can we just give Garrett Park some money?
Yeah.
So we're hoping that even if we don't have a long-term fix before the executive puts out his budget in 2 weeks, that at least we can get a chunk put in for us. Sort of.
So I think the other part of this is the section of the county code that deals with tax duplication has a very specific provision that allows a municipality to essentially petition for a payment that they're not getting. I did that last year. The county executive's office and the Office of Management and Budget couldn't give me any guidance on what they wanted to see, so I took my best shot at it. There is the new analyst in OMB who has been assigned to deal with tax duplication payments. He reached out when he first started. He happens to be a former city manager, which I thought would come in handy. I explained to him, just as I had the county executive's office, and said, look, if anyone can find this report, for Mike Leggett's term, there is a formula. That's all you have to locate. I've done everything I can, but I'm telling you, there's a roadmap for this. This year, or like was actually last year, because it's due by November 15th, the county executive's office and the Office of Management and Budget said, hey, put together a spreadsheet and detail out by your spaces what you spend. So worked with our maintenance staff, did that, and for naught, because no one seems to have done anything with it. So I did hear after we got kicked to the curb for the second year in a row from Councilmember Kate Stewart, who's obviously our district rep. Basically saying, let's talk and see if we can do something. My hope, as Joanna is suggesting, we have submitted what we believe our costs are for maintaining, Cambria Park as well as Porcupine Woods, other open spaces. My hope as well, as I said to Ken Hartman, he's in the county executive's office. As I said to him, look, I understand the difficulty that you're having in trying to wrestle with this issue, but basically you're making Garrett Park pay the price because you haven't worked on this and you've known about this for a year now.
So if we get it funded, is it going to be for more than 1 year?
I think if we get anything in FY 2025, what I believe they will do, and what I'm hoping is that they'll give us some token payment to make me go away at least for a while. And I think when they started really looking at the payments, and I don't have the schedule in front of me, there are certainly some municipalities, Friendship Heights in particular is the one that's really sticking in their craw, candidly. They're getting a massive payment. I think it's somewhere in the range of $90-some thousand. And I think they're looking at that and basically trying to say, well, why does that make sense? And the formula that had been tentatively agreed upon, when Mike Leggett was county executive, was to go to Montgomery Parks. The plan was to use the Montgomery Parks classification system for their parks. So they have different types of parks. They already have an existing database where they calculate what their per acre cost of maintenance is for a particular classification of parks. So I think there's a very easy answer to this. I don't think it has to basically be reinventing the wheel because that data is in the Montgomery Park system.
But Montgomery County chapter of MML is making it a priority, not just because I made a stink at a dinner and because Barb made a stink, but I think other municipalities are having issues with this.
Well,
because I
if
think
some
they're all-
municipalities are getting $100,000 and others aren't getting
It's
anything, it
different,
doesn't
yeah,
seem like
but there are
it's
lots of
fair.
dis- So
So-
that is a priority and,
Right.
and hoping to get a chunk so
Yeah,
that we can at
just,
least pacify us for the short term, but then we will be working on it this year.
Yeah, and so
I'm
I,
assuming
yeah,
so.
I think, like I say, I do understand, as I said to Ken Hartman, I do understand the concern that you have in wanting to have some understanding of why you're making the payments you are, and that there's a basis for it. I think
Right.
my only concern is, I've been talking to you for almost 2 years now about this, so the fact that nothing's been done, doesn't sit well
So
with Garrett
how
Park.
much are we, if we got what we think it's costing us to maintain the parks, is it
I
like
can pull
30
it-
grand or 100
It's
grand?
more than that. I think when I can pull it up, Lisa, once I bring this down, because I can't reach my files, but, by the time I added up everything, it was in excess of $50,000
Per year,
per year.
okay.
Yeah, because you're
Well,
also,
that's helpful,
because you're also able to count your staff time,
right?
not only your hard cost, part
Staff,
of
right.
the reason, I think it was actually probably closer to about 75, because part of it was, I was assuming that, I think they would accept this, is that we start setting aside money for the eventual replacement of the playground equipment at Cambria Park. And
Right.
so you can kind of look long-term, not just your operational expenses, but what you will be incurring. So anyway, that was disappointing, to say the least, but we'll see where it goes.
Not over yet.
Not over. Normally, I would be telling you sort of like what we would be proposing for the household assessment, for trash, recycling, yard waste, and large items. As you know, the household assessment is designed to cover 100% of the cost of those services. The assessment for FY 2024 was $395 per household. It was also that in FY 2023. As you probably recall, back in August, we had a special town council meeting to deal with the fact that the county had raised their tipping fees, and Key Sanitation understandably had some concerns. That bid package is out on the street, and RFP responses are due March 7th. So basically, once those bids come in, Kayla will be analyzing those. And we should be able to tell you, shortly thereafter, what we're recommending for the household
There
assessment.
was also a fuel surcharge, as I recall.
There is,
Right.
yeah,
So it'll all be part of the.
it's all part
proposal.
of that, right?
And that comes from the household
does.
assessment,
Right.
the tax that we pay anyway.
No, it's on top of that.
It's on top of
Oh.
that. So if you look at your property tax bill, there will actually be the
Oh,
Garrett Park
it's the
refuse
property
thing.
tax bill.
Right, and that's how we bill it, because obviously the county, it's a lot easier for them to collect it than for
Okay.
us.
Now, can we retroactively get the money that we,
The only way you could do that, Phil,
Park service
is,
money?
is to,
No, The Park Service money, or you're talking about the rest of the assessment?
I'm talking about tipping fees, the diesel fuel.
yeah, so actually what I had done for the current fiscal year is, I assumed since fuel rates were so high, I did build something into the rate. What I did not anticipate was, because we didn't know it was a tipping fee increase on trash. So that part, we're absorbing it, as you might recall from Kayla's presentation back on February 12th. We have some excess money left over from the compost program. That's how we're paying that roughly $8,000 shortfall. But in a perfect world, it would be being paid by residents.
Sure.
The only way you can go back retroactively is to build something into the FY 2025 rate, but
Sure.
obviously people have left Garrett Park, people have moved in, so we're not necessarily hitting the same people who benefited in FY 2024.
But
For
it's
the-
likely that this rate will go up. Is that,
I think there's a decent chance of that, yeah. I don't think significantly, but we'll have to see what bids we get.
That $395 per house that goes to the county and does not come back to us, or?
No, what happens is it's billed through the county. The county basically handles it, the billing on the property tax bills, but then they just remit it to us.
Okay.
So they're just a collection agency
We
for us. Kind of switching, it's pretty early in terms of just, doing any of the personnel costs. Candidly, that's sort of a laborious task, so I have not yet begun that, but it's, just takes about a day. What you do have on the expenditure side, and they're included in your agenda packet, are the town committee funding request. I always reach out to them and ask them kind of what their thoughts are about what they need to fulfill their mission in the upcoming fiscal year. From my perspective, I thought all of the funding requests from the committees were very well thought out. I thought they were reasonable. Certainly it's your decision, but it would be my recommendation that you fund the committee request at the level they've requested, and that'll be a discussion point later in the meeting. A couple of things just on the capital side. I did include in your agenda packet, a copy of the financial report from January, because that was the last complete month that we had. A couple of things that I just wanted to call to your attention, as you start getting ready to discuss the budget. You may remember that about, I don't know, 4 or 5 months ago, I mentioned to you that we kind of changed our accounting practice during this fiscal year. And we're charging Arboretum related expenses to the operating budget. Typically, what is budgeted from a capital standpoint are items that have a useful life and basically are subject to depreciation. So while tree planting has trees hopefully have a long life, they're not subject to depreciation from an accounting standpoint.
Not yet.
Not yet. I don't think they will be. There's been so much accounting board stuff about infrastructure during my career. So right now there is an unexpended balance in account 29.2, which is a capital account labeled as Arboretum of $71,922. I would encourage you to basically kind of close out that account and allocate that funding to whatever capital line item you want.
Can I ask a quick question? Are the
Sure.
trees that we need to hopefully soon identify to replace the trees on Waverly? Are those budgeted already? Or can this money be a source of that?
So here's kind of the way it was handled for a number of years, is what was charged to capital were tree removals, which made no sense to me because they're costly, but they're certainly not adding to the useful life of anything. And then tree planting. And then there was a kind of a strange differentiation between scheduled removals and emergency removals. I'm not sure why that distinction was made. There'll be, I consider replacing the trees for that stretch of sidewalk as sort of a project cost to be sure. I think in that instance, capital makes sense because we're removing trees due to the construction and therefore we're replacing trees. I
Right.
think the general planting
Right.
isn't a capital expense. But yeah, I think we can accommodate that in the actual sidewalk budget.
And the answer to your question.
Yeah.
Was the reason they were split was because one was operating. And the scheduled tree removals were capital, and the capital was put in there as a bucket to hold the money.
Yeah.
For the year.
Yeah, and we've been able, like this year, we're doing a lot of tree work because we are planning catch up, which I know Jerry can speak to since she's the Arboretum Committee liaison. But I do think the operating budget is the appropriate place unless the tree activity is related to an actual construction project. Kind of along the same lines, there's a very nominal amount of money in account 32.4. This is the Arboretum plan and tree inventory, as I understand it. It was for any kind of technical, professional, external assistance that might be needed. Mary Retke, our accountant, and I have discussed this. We both agree that that is really an operating expense. It's a professional fee. Certainly, I think if the committee needs any assistance, that should be built into their budget. But there's an unexpended balance of $2,875. So my suggestion is just as you have talked about trying to sort of clean up the capital document, move to more of a long-range CIP. I think these are two accounts where that funding should be reallocated to something else. I don't have an opinion on what that should be. That's a policy issue, but I do think these are funds that should be made available for other capital projects.
Barb, if I could just
Yeah.
help clarify this point. The committee is proposing an increase on the operating side to address costs that would have otherwise in the past been paid out of capital.
Yeah.
But when I took over as Arboretum, it was very complex to try and figure out how to develop the Arboretum budget every year because of this not entirely logical split between operating and capital. And so what Barb is proposing, I think is a great idea to simplify our budget and put all of the Arboretum work in the operating side and not in the capital
Yeah,
side.
and I will
Unless there is a big project like the sidewalk that includes tree work as part of the infrastructure project.
Yeah, and I will tell you, we've been doing, I think we've been doing a great job with your level of funding you all have provided of trying to catch up on things. We've got good tree contractors. We know who does what well, so we know who to have, do what particular task. But it's not unusual where we've have scheduled removals as well as prunings, and then something emergency happens. So I'll get this massive invoice, broken down. And I used to be my first, couple months here, I was sitting there trying to figure out which line item it went to, because we'd have to really go through and say, okay, hey, Phil Normandy, which tree was this and which was the emergency? And I think it's just much simpler to say it's all tree related work and it's all important and what's needed to do that.
So are you recommending that we get rid of line item 32.4
Yeah,
And
and,
then-
and 29.2.
and 29? So get rid of those, and then for Waverly, for example, we will just specify that as that tree work is part of that project.
Yes.
Okay.
Phil Normandy preferred, obviously when you're removing the trees, he had no concerns about having whoever we hire as a contractor for that project remove the trees. He preferred to actually select the trees and basically install those either by either with our own staff or by one of our vendors.
Right,
Um,
rather than having the
Contractor,
sidewalk.
the sidewalk contractor, yeah, he was not comfortable with it.
And that's who's removing the tree.
Yeah, the contractor will remove them, but not plant.
Okay,
Um,
that's fine.
Sorry, I'm sorry,
Okay.
just to,
Sure.
if we eliminate those two items, where do we put, I understand we want one arboretum item. Is that correct? That we have two now?
Right,
Where do we
actually,
put
We
that?
actually have 4 now. And so
Yes.
we're going back to.
yeah, what would happen, Todd, is these accounts would essentially, and that funding, if you agree with this recommendation, you would take that 71,922 and that 2,875, and you would, as an elected body, decide what capital project you want to transfer those funds to.
Okay, but then how do we pay for the?
It's handled on the operating side.
Just-
And the
okay.
Arboretum Committee, I provided
I
them
see.
with historical data for all the accounts, so they could kind of see trends.
Okay,
And they could have a comfort level in what they were recommending.
okay. so
And
it
I think
just
they've
goes
done
from
that.
Capital to
Yeah.
operations.
Yeah, so it's
More-
essentially, if you agree with what the Arboretum Committee recommended, we
Okay.
should be fine, barring some wind shear or something that, decimates the Arboretum. And then this roughly $75,000 is available to be reallocated to another capital line item, whatever of your choosing.
Okay,
Okay, any other questions? I just wanted to comment on a couple capital projects that I know are of interest to you. And once again, I'll finish this up and then, bring this down and you can just take it from there. As you know, there was budget amendment number 2 was introduced back at your meeting in February. So there are some funding things that are kind of in process right now that aren't reflected in the January financial report because you haven't adopted the ordinance. But if that ordinance is actually adopted as presented, what you would have for town hall as far as available funding currently is 1.56 million roughly. And this is a breakdown of where those funds are now. So, you will have roughly $1 million in account 27.2, which is, these are all capital accounts. There's 55,000 in what's known as a capital planning account. I don't know what your thoughts are. When Mary and I've talked about this, I think I tend to think of capital planning as almost the initial feasibility study. I think you're kind of moved beyond that at this point. So you might want to move that 55,000 up to 27.2. And then we have funding in ARPA.
And that's the net of what we haven't spent on other things.
This is just the ARPA funding for town hall.
Okay.
What I would probably, we haven't actually bid out. If you remember, the mega bid that's going out is going to cover Waverly, the Weymouth speed bump, Argyle Kenilworth reconfiguration, and paving. I don't know what those amounts are going to be. I had some preliminary conversation with Jason, which you'll see in kind of the very preliminary rough draft CIP. They have actually added a street because they came back through and resurveyed the streets. My guess is once you award that contract and then we do call it, there's probably a more professional way of putting this, but this sort of funding switcheroo where we basically charge something to ARPA. So we make sure the funds are committed, and then we, basically we'll probably have another budget amendment candidly to kind of switch things back around between these projects. But I think there's a very good chance that between, the town office renovation, we did another permitting snafu today. And when you award a contract for Waverly, if if that Waverly and all those other projects, if that project gets charged, all these projects get charged to ARPA, which is I think what we have talked about. I think all the ARPA funds will then be committed. So there might be some internal accounting we need to do. But all those projects together, may even, will probably eat up all of the town hall ARPA money, which will then be replenished. Does that make sense? So I think the good news is we're very close to committing the ARPA funding.
So we're not losing anything, which
We
is
won't lose anything.
all we're worried about for so long.
No, I mean, and actually, just as a reminder, the deadline for obligating ARPA funds is December 31st of 2024.
Right.
Obligation means you have a signed contract. You don't
Right.
even have to have the work done at that point. So I feel like with kind of how you all chose to approach the ARPA funding and kind of moving some projects forward that were already funded and then kind of making these adjustments, I think that will leave us in a very good place in terms of the ARPA
But
funding,
the
committing those.
ARPA money that we have available just for the town hall is whatever that number
The
is.
460, yeah,
460.
465.
So the
what-
rest of it we've spent on other things.
Or it's in the process of being committed.
Okay.
For this other mega contract.
Yeah, so what will happen is you'll, probably, we got our historic area work permit, as I told you all, for Waverly, and we know the alignment now. So that project will get bid. It'll be brought back to you, especially since you're probably looking at having a special meeting to kind of finish up the budget. You'll make that contract award. We'll know what that amount is, and then probably what will happen. And I know it seems convoluted, but then we'll have probably another budget amendment that will basically charge that bid award amount to the ARPA funds, and then what was funded for those projects will then replenish account 27.2, just as you did with budget amendment 1. So I think the good news is, Stephen commented back in February, you all have really been, putting a lot of funding towards town hall. Stephen, you have the historical context, but you said you remembered when it was much less than that.
yeah.
And so I think,
1/10 of that, or 1/8 of that.
yeah, so I think, once this budget amendment gets adopted and all the, accounting gets, sorted out, because it does take 21 days after that ordinance is adopted for it to take effect. So you won't actually see the impact of what I'm showing on the screen until probably the May financial report.
But this is the amount that we can mentally say.
Mentally,
we
that's what I
have
was trying to
Which
do.
is obligated.
Right.
Yes, that's.
Right, this is sort of what you have already, by introducing the ordinance, that signaled to me that you were comfortable with this. And I think as you go forward and trying to, because I think the capital side of the budget is much more complex. But this should give you a sense of what you have in hand for town hall now. And that can kind of guide, the rest of your
Because
discussion.
the budget, the projected budget now is still over 2 million, right? For
It's
the-
much higher than that.
So it's.
Yeah,
So
so
we still need a gap,
that's my next slide.
right,
We'll get to that.
We needed the gap for a very long time, so
Right.
the gap got smaller.
right.
Oh.
Yeah, yeah, so,
Yeah.
what I had to do for the fact sheet that I had to file for our legislative bond initiative, so there's an initial, relatively, I wouldn't say it's a cursory filing, but you have very limited space on all these things, so you have to pick your words wisely, because it really does cut you off, as I found out the hard way with the fact sheet. So basically, we had to essentially take the Axios estimate for concept 4, which was, which is not the 3.268, but then we had to add on, as you likely recall from your prior discussions last year, kind of an estimate for architectural and engineering services. The turnaround time for the fact sheet, I had less than 5 days to do it. So I talked to Wiedemann. We came up with some rough numbers for architectural and engineering services. I think Stephen has made this comment in the past. I do think, Axios's numbers are probably conservative. So
Right.
hopefully the cost would be less than this. But I think just for planning purposes, we had to start someplace, and I
Right.
had to turn something into the State Department of Legislative Services. So right now, just using the $3,268,000. As you know, we requested $750,000 through the Legislative Bond Initiative Funding Request Program. The status of that is going to be unknown until, the legislative session is over.
But I will ask tomorrow.
Yeah, yeah, and I think, we'll just see kind of how things are going, and Joanna will be able to see some of our, delegation and ask them that. In your agenda packet materials, I did mention that I was I had a meeting scheduled with a representatives from both Cardin and Van Hollen office. So it was the regional manager assigned to area manager for Montgomery County and Cardin's office, and it was a legislative staff member on the Van Hollen side. The reason I had scheduled that meeting with them is they had, as they do every year, had offered a training session on what used to be called earmark funding. Now it's congressionally directed funding / earmarked is what everyone still calls it. But when I was going through the material, see, when you apply, you have to apply under a specific program. And as I look through the materials that Cardin Van Hollen's office had provided, I did not see a path forward for earmark funding. So I just wanted to make sure I wasn't missing something. So I had a call with them on Monday of this week. We talked about town hall, there's specific funding, there's a whole lot of transportation related funding. But you have to be on like the Montgomery County Master Plan. So, certainly it's a building project, not a road project. There's environmental projects, but there are categories of funding that are set aside for rural communities, which of course we are not. There are programs that are income-based, which we don't match those, or the income levels are too high, which is not surprising, I think, to anyone in this room. And so what it kind of came down to was whether, Garrett Park as a community, as a town, is on the National Register of Historic Places. There is a whole series of funding, both through congressionally directed earmark funding, as well as federal grant programs, if your building itself has a designation, which Town Hall does not.
Could we get one?
Joanna and I were talking about this last night.
Contributing property and that doesn't count?
I don't believe so.
That's a different
So,
thing. It would have to be individually listed on the National
Right.
Register, and you probably could put it on. like, with
yeah, I mean, I
scratch,
think
but-
what I said, Joanna and I were talking about this last evening, I think there is a process that you have to go through. So it certainly wouldn't be for the cycle right now because we couldn't get through that process. And I would also think we'd want to know more about it because once your building has
There's a lot of.
there's a lot of
restrictions
restrictions and that may be,
when we try to renovate
it may not actually be worth it
Right.
from a control standpoint,
Right.
if you will. So what I would say to you based on everything, I thought this might be the case. So I guess the good news is I could read the materials. The bad news is there is not a path forward for us for this project.
For federal funding.
For federal earmark funding. I'm gonna schedule a follow-up call with the grants person in Van Hollen's office. I had a relationship with him when I was in Westminster for some grants we were pursuing. And just to ask Bart if there's something I'm not seeing. Because that is what his whole job is in Van Hollen's office, is to understand the federal grants process. So that was a little bit disappointing, but it's kind of where we're at. So if we, and I'm optimistic based on, I see Benjamin is is participating in the meeting or watching us. As I mentioned at the last meeting, he had a conversation with some members of our delegation while he was basically up in Annapolis for a different matter. And I agree with him. I think Joanna and I've had met with the entire delegation. I think they are supportive. Obviously, the overall picture of the state budget will come into play and the number of other requests that are made, from Montgomery County. But I think at least they seem supportive of our project. I will be sorely disappointed if we get absolutely nothing. Likewise, I will be shocked, I think, if we were to get the entire 750,000. I knew going into that based on our conversation, particularly with Delegate Solomon, who sits on appropriations, as does one other member of our delegation, that was probably aiming high, hoping that, if we aimed high, maybe we would have a fighting chance of getting something in the $500,000 range. We're about 6 weeks out from probably knowing, definitively where things stand. But I think the worst case scenario is we identify no other external funding. You all don't, contribute another dime to town hall, which I think is unlikely. But under that scenario and the numbers we're talking about, we would have a shortfall of about $1.7 million.
Based on the Axios projections.
Right,
projected
and my
budget
own,
Plus
and-
your
right.
added,
Right.
Cost.
So we're halfway there.
We're about halfway there.
if we get the whole 750.
No. If
Right
we
now.
get, If we get nothing.
Oh,
we're about-
If we get
If
nothing,
we get the 750, then we're short 750.
we're short of, yeah, we're short about $1 million roughly.
So I spoke to Peter Benjamin today, just because he knows so much
He
about
does, yeah.
funding. And I asked him about if there are other sources or, you know, what his thoughts were, and he thought, based on his conversations with the parties to be, who he speaks with a lot, he thinks we're gonna get the 750.
Be great.
And he also said that we could also go back the following year.
Yeah,
So that's kind of was his recommendation.
yeah, and I think it's sort of
It's
it can
not
be
a one-shot deal.
right. I would say it can be a catch-22 because I can also say I worked someplace where we were working towards getting external funding for a project. This happened to be, and I'm sure Stephen has run into this in his business. You know, we were doing a project in Westminster and steel prices just went nuts. And it was basically a lot of steel work in the building we were doing. You know, sometimes what can happen also is the longer you defer a project, construction costs just don't generally get cheaper. They get more expensive.
Correct.
So there's sort of a risk analysis there. You know, if we were to end up with whatever, I think inevitably, there's going to be some shortfall and some gap. And I think at this point, you know, I think the federal programming options, I'm still going to work on it, as I said. You know, there's a couple other state sources. One is Community Legacy. I talked to the staff person who handles that program. That there are a certain group of state funding programs that are available if you are a sustainable community. And what that means in Maryland is it is a certain planning designation. So I'm looking in to see what would that take to basically get that designation, because I think community legacy funding is a possibility.
But some of these things we won't really be able to apply for them until we're further along in the project.
Correct.
So to some extent, we need to decide, you know, look at the what then.
Yeah.
Decide what we're going to do, and then.
Yeah.
And then we just sort of, we make our decision, and then if we happen to get money after we're further along, then we're just in better position.
Yeah.
As opposed to,
Yeah, and I'm not trying to be gloom or doom. I think I think there's obviously other capital projects that you have interest in, and you talked about that at your retreat. You know, and I think that's your job, is to look out for the community as a whole. And, you know, there may be a point where you feel like there's only so much you can put into one particular capital
Well,
project.
the big wild card in my thinking is stormwater management.
Correct, which is a big,
Because we have, you know, I think that, you know, there's no fixed amount of zeros that could
yeah, and I'm going to be,
require.
and I'll be talking about that momentarily.
Right.
So, I mean, what I'm asking you just to kind of think about is, you know, certainly we continue to try to pursue external sources of funding.
Right.
But worst case scenario, you might be looking at a shortfall of 1.7 million. And so my question is, then what then?
Right.
And I think things for you to sort of just think about, I don't think you need to necessarily make a decision tonight, is obviously one option is you scale back the project scope to match what you have in
Right.
hand.
Just patch it up and.
One,
keep
as
it
we've
going.
talked about, you defer a project till you have the funding in hand,
Right.
wherever that funding is. The third, which is candidly what a lot of local governments will do with capital projects that have generational impacts, is a bond part of it.
Right.
And that is a very common thing to do.
So then we'd need an amortization schedule and.
I
some
have-
assumptions and
Right, so
that would
I
be per
have.
household.
I have already reached out,
Mm.
just because, so the Maryland Local Government Infrastructure Program is a program that is commonly used, and it actually was designed for municipalities who do not have their own bond rating. So what you typically see, there was a point in time in my career where if you didn't have a bond rating, you could essentially buy a bond rating, if you will, through insurance. That market no longer really exists.
Right.
So unless you're a Rockville or a Gaithersburg or a Frederick or a lot of the counties, most municipalities aren't going to go through the time and effort to get their own bond rating. When I was in Tacoma Park, we used the local government infrastructure program for a variety of projects. We used it again when I was in Westminster, and actually Garrett Park used it for the Penn Place renovations as part of the funding.
Well, Peter told me that Penn Place renovation cost the citizens of Garrett Park nothing. Is that not true?
I mean, we were making debt service payments, so,
Right.
you know, I would argue.
But through the capital budget, through the budget of
Yeah,
Garrett Park,
there-
not additional funds. that we
No,
asked?
There were a
for?
series of grants. There was some, I think about 800, Stephen was actually asking this the other day. It was about $800,000 roughly a bond that we paid debt service on for 20 years.
We meaning the.
We
tier
meaning the
part.
tier part.
So it came out of the budget.
Oh,
Right, it was part of the budget.
We didn't
not the
go,
households.
yeah,
It was part of the budget, but yes, there was not a special tax
we
assessment
didn't
for that.
increase the amount of
Right,
money
it
it
didn't
costs to
increase
live in
taxes.
Garrett
It didn't
Park
increase
to pay
taxes.
And
for it.
the
Right.
rents at Penn Place helped to cover. a
Correct.
significant
Right.
portion.
Yeah,
This
so.
place does not have a significant rent in it.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, it does not. So I reached out to a guy named Charlie Day. He basically manages the program. And asked him to run scenarios. And you can't do this endlessly because they're
Right.
paying an outside financial advisor to do this. And I can send these to you, later this evening. But I asked him to run scenarios for $1 million and 1.7 million. I'm going off memory here, but so what they had to do obviously is there's all sorts of qualifiers on it because we would not be issuing debt this year. They
Right.
usually do, depends on the number of participants, but they generally do at least one issuance, and it's generally in the spring. So depending on the number of people who participate in that issuance determines kind of what your administrative costs are that get rolled in. So they had to like a lot of assumptions based on rates, which obviously they're high now. There's no doubt about that. And just a reminder, kind of general interest, there's mortgage interest rates. There are tax benefits to buying, governmental debt as part of your portfolio. Usually it's bought by banks, not individuals. So my recollection is $1 million had a roughly, it averages out over 20 years. That's the
have it.
term I gave them. It was about roughly $75,000 a year.
Yeah, 77,000 for
And
$1 million.
And 1.7 was about 145,000.
130.
Okay, 130,000.
And that's a 20-year
No, I
amortization.
asked for 20.
If
You
you
can,
go longer,
you can go longer.
and then it
Um,
would come down.
Yeah, I would say in my experience, whether it's roads or building projects, water sewer treatment plants, I would say 20 years has generally been the bond maturity that places I've worked have used. 30 starts feeling kind of long.
Right,
For some places, 10 years is kind of short.
Right.
And at times, I think there's obviously the longer the debt, the more you carry interest. On the other hand, a lot of people try to look at the maturity of the debt tied to the asset life and the improved
Right.
life. So like I say, I'm not asking you to make a decision. I'm just saying this is food for thought as you try to figure out what to do especially on the capital side of the budget. Because I
but I
do,
think what you're saying, or my understanding is if we did say we want $1.7 million, or we want $1 million short of what we got from funding and
Right.
what we've got from DARPA and other sources in our budget, we could absorb the $77,000 in our existing budget without increasing the tax rate.
Year.
yeah,
right.
I
But
think, I think
I don't
it's
think the
something,
number's right because
I can show you the debt. chart.
20 times 77 and so that's for the lower, that's for 1 million. It only winds
Right.
up being 1.5 million.
Yeah, I can actually send you the
Total
debt
gap.
service schedules. I can do that once I bring this down.
Okay,
But what you'll see is, they assumed a true interest cost, I believe, of about 4.5%.
Because it's tax exempt.
It's tax exempt,
Yeah.
exactly. And you'll see the assumptions. I mean, I would say that they're, from the time I initially reached out to them on the million to preparing for this presentation and asking them to do the 1.7, they reran the million because the number of, basis points had gone up.
Right,
So, they're not going to say that's what it's definitively going to be, but they have
Right.
to base it on what they believe to be reasonable assumptions.
as of today,
As of today.
right.
but the 1.7 is higher than 77, right?
Yes, it's
Yeah,
130.
130.
It's 130 a year.
Yeah, so what I would say is, I'm not saying that this can be easily absorbed, and I'm not going to sit here and tell you that. Part of the reason why I wanted to start with the revenue stuff is unlike a lot of states, including some I've worked in, where you have alternative ways to raise money as a municipality, that simply does not exist in Maryland.
Right,
So, I think as you consider, what to do with any type of bonding and the related debt service, some of that also factors into, since whatever we bring in is also supporting capital. Part of this whole conversation that I think you all need to have is, what are the capital projects you want to do? Because,
In addition to town. hall.
right, because what we do is we basically say, okay, here's the revenue we bring in. Here's what it takes to fund operations, and really what's left over goes to capital. Well, if on the debts, if on the operational side, you're now having 75,000 or 130,000 of debt service, that automatically translates into less money available for capital. And
For other projects.
yeah, other than
Right.
what the funding, you know,
Because the money's got to come from somewhere. You can't
Right.
make money out of nothing.
exactly.
Right.
So it is, like I say, I'm hoping tonight is more kind of food for thought, because I think it is going to be a lot of you all discussing what are your priorities. And I think once I have a better sense of that, you know, we can certainly have another work session. I can run scenarios. But there's no doubt that taking on, you know, debt service payments impacts your ability to do other things.
Correct.
It's not free money. So
That seems like about, if we borrow 1.7 million, it seems like I don't know, 7 or 8% of the operating budget every year.
well,
it's-
what I would say is up until a couple, I mean, we just paid
Oh,
off.
sorry, revenue. Yeah.
We only, during my tenure here, we made the last debt service payment on Penn Place. So
Twenty
that was,
twenty-two, I think, right?
And what was that a year for?
I could go back and look. I think that would be really easy for me to run for you, Lisa,
Okay.
and I'll put that as a follow-up
would be good
item.
to know.
But I think it was, at one point, I think it was in, you know, obviously it's like your mortgage, the more you start paying down, you
Right.
know. But it was around, I think, in the $70,000 range at one time.
So it's-
Um,
the larger loan would be 5.5% of the operating budget.
I count on you to run the math, but I mean, I think what it probably most would impact is, you know, if you look at our revenue stream, and obviously income taxes are just screwy right now, for a lack of a better way of putting it. You know, I think assessments in Garrett Park are going to continue to go up. I mean, and they have, and I think they'll continue to do that.
Yeah.
Mine did
Yeah,
too.
but I mean, but I think what you pick up from the assessments is not a huge amount of money, but you know, certainly would those continuing increases in assessments help to pay any debt service? Yes,
Well, we also have operating costs that go up, like people
Correct.
want raises and.
Correct.
You know,
And
we're running
inflation
a
is
little
high.
company here.
right.
I mean,
Um,
5.5%. I mean, last year inflation was probably.
Right, so I think there's a
5%.
bunch of different pieces that impact this. I
Right.
would say that, you know, all that, basically, I think it might be Maryland, I'm not sure, but whoever the state's consultant is who runs all these, who's their financial advisor for this program, they have to look at what rates are today.
Right,
Um,
and that's no guarantee. It'll
Right.
be that rate when we're ready to sell.
right,
But these are fixed rates once we get them. They're not
right,
floaters.
no,
right?
no, they're not variable rates.
Okay.
It's a
You
good
know,
question.
but we would really, you know, when I first started talking to Mr. Day, you know, I told him, I said, look, you know, Garrett Park, unlike a lot of places, has been saving for this project. So we could get through the design process, we could, you know, so I wouldn't even, at the earliest, and I'm not even sure we need to do that, we wouldn't be looking at doing any bonding until probably the spring of 2025. I mean,
After we have plans and specs and bids.
Right.
essentially.
So kind of what we need to do, if we want to move forward, is we have to be comfortable with the concept of either scaling back the project to match our funding, or be comfortable with needing to borrow as much as 1.7 million. And then hope that we get 75 or 750,000 from the state, hope that as we make progress on the design, that we can go back and look for other grants and other things.
and rates fall.
And rates fall. I mean, so there are lots of things, but if we go the route of taking out a bond, as long as we're comfortable with the max, it'll probably be less than that.
Right,
It'll probably be a better scenario.
yeah, and I think.
I kind of, my own take on this, I don't know if we wanted to come back to this.
No,
but
you
since we're
don't,
on it,
I mean.
is I would like to be cynical and think that we're not gonna get any more money and just think, okay, what's the worst case scenario?
We're not gonna get the 750, is that what
No,
you're
no,
saying?
no, I'm saying in my mind,
Nothing.
in order to feel comfortable to move forward,
Right,
I need to be cynical in my mind and say, okay, it's worst case scenario. Am I comfortable with asking the coming generations who will be using this building to help pay for it in the coming years that they're actually using it, am I comfortable with taking on this debt, even if it's at the worst case of 1.7?
And not having those funds to pay other
Exactly.
costs that we're gonna
Right.
maybe need to do.
And so we kind of, to some extent, if we want to move forward with this project, we have to, if we want to keep it at the scale that it is, the scope of project that it is, we sort of have to be comfortable with that discomfort
Right.
and hope that it's less discomfort.
It's real uncertainty is
It
what it
is.
is.
But
Right.
if we're but, you know,
Yeah.
that's not a bad thing.
Yeah.
So. but-
Yeah,
I mean,
Jerry,
I may,
sorry.
I mean, I think this is where the CIP, the
Yeah.
infrastructure capital improvement plan draft that Barb put in the packet as a start comes into play because, you know, we're all thinking about other things we want to do, like Cambria Park renovations and stormwater management, but all of those need planning and lead
They
up
do.
time, just as we've been doing with town hall.
Yeah.
So even if we designated one of those as a secondary priority that we want to start working on, we've got some years probably
Right.
of planning work to do before we would actually need
Yeah.
money to execute on those. So that's something to think about too, that there's no way we can do everything all at once because we have bandwidth issues in terms of our own ability to plan and execute projects.
Right. And
That's
so,
correct.
you want me
So,
to just-
so, I mean, for this, I don't know if you all want to talk about this now, or if you want to just like sort of soak it in, we can send you the
the debt service
the-
schedule, yeah,
the debt
amortization
service.
schedule.
Yeah, I'd like to
and-
know what Penn Place was that we just stopped
I can-
paying, and then what these numbers would
Sure.
be in today's dollars if rates are the same, and then at least we've got
You've got
a
some
feel for
parameters.
where this fits.
Yeah.
So,
and-
because we have just paid off Penn Place and we were able to absorb those costs in our
Yeah,
budget.
I mean, I think to Jerry Lee's point, you know, I think based on everything I know from having been here about 2.5 years, taking on debt isn't going to, you know, operationally, the town's going to be fine. I think the question becomes, what is then left available to transfer to capital? And how does that jive, for lack of a better way of putting it, with what you want to do?
Right.
When there's an opportunity cost, right? Which
That's
is-
what I'm saying. Yeah, I was gonna call it
Yeah.
economics major. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
exactly. And that's where I say, if it's okay, maybe what I might do is click through a couple of the more of the capital type of
Sure.
things. And then, because I think you've touched on some of them.
So, and just to understand the process, we're meeting tonight. What are we supposed to produce out of this? Just an idea?
Guidance to Barb about
Yeah,
direction to take
so,
continued development of the budget.
so right now, Todd, from a scheduling standpoint, so let me kind of back up, because this is the first time you'll be kind of through the budget process.
This is a
So,
very informative meeting.
yeah,
Sorry
so
to ask
what
questions.
you have until, obviously, the fiscal year doesn't start to July 1, you know, there's most people don't wait to June 30th because you have to basically set up your accounting and things. The biggest trigger is you have to decide on the tax rates. Like most jurisdictions, our tax rates are embedded in the budget adoption ordinance. They don't have to be, but we have a hard deadline to adopt tax rates it's usually towards the end of May. And that's because the county has to do all of its programming for not only itself, but all the municipalities. And there's no wiggle room in that, you know, so you could, I'm not suggesting it necessarily, you could deal with the tax rate piece of it by May and continue budget discussions into June. But at some point, I think you know what you know.
Mhm. So do we have one more meeting? I mean, ultimately, we vote on the budget, hopefully before May.
Right.
Is that, what
Right.
is your
So I
plan?
think, I think a great way to go about this is to vote on it at the May meeting. So May meeting is right after the election. And so what we could do is meet this group as the current, you know, it's not like Congress with session one, you know, like it's the 102nd Congress. We got to come up with a nomenclature for that. But we could meet as this body at the beginning of that meeting, close that meeting.
Yeah, I need to check that with Ron Bolt. What I was saying, one of the things in our charter, which is a little different, is it specifically states that those elected, you know, on the first Monday in May, take office the following Monday. Most of the jurisdictions I've worked in, and every charter and every code is different, but they would basically, like you all as the sitting group, would kick off the May meeting.
Right.
Then you would do, it's the Latin phrase, you sine die, you know, your term is done. You swear in the people who are newly elected or, you know, those who are returning but newly elected. And then that group basically takes over. You have had some discussion, which you can certainly change what you're doing. Right now, I'm working towards drafting the budget ordinance for introduction at your meeting in April, which means I have roughly 30 days to basically put all the numbers together. You know, there's obviously changes you make. You all have made some changes. You know, the cap to me, I mean, our operations are sort of fairly standard from year to year. There's not that much difference. And from a materiality standpoint, there's not much. The capital piece, I think, is the part that you're going to talk about tonight. You already have been, and that you're probably going to talk about a lot whenever you choose to do that. You know, there's certainly nothing saying you can't have another work session, you know, before your April meeting, if you so choose. That's part of what I'm trying to get hope to get a sense of tonight, if there's another meeting you want to have. But I think what you had talked about previously was introducing the budget ordinance at your scheduled meeting in April, and possibly trying to adopt the budget by having a special meeting before the newly elected, the group may change over. Just because, you know, imagine, Todd, if you had to go through this budget process on your first night. Yeah, that's challenging. I've worked in jurisdictions where that has happened, and that's really tough for the person who's just joining. But I think
in the past, I think we've adopted the budget in April.
yeah.
And
So you steer clear of that.
We did that we did that last year, actually.
Yeah, that was an attempt to try to expedite the schedule.
Right, and we did. You know, so I think you do have some options here, and I probably would suggest, I mean, I'm gonna go ahead and start, you know, calculating personnel cost and all that type of stuff, regardless of what, you know, decision you make, because I need to do that. I do think in the absence of some direction, whether that's this evening or, you know, I take my best shot at it for your April introduction, the capital piece is something that is very much reflective of what your priorities are, and only you can define those.
But the tricky part about the capital piece is a lot of these numbers we don't know. So it's hard to build a capital budget on numbers that.
But I think we can take a good stab at it conceptually.
Do you think we can for stormwater management?
Well, and let me, if I can go ahead, here's what I was gonna say. So I think that this is the biggest issue I see complicating this budget process is, as you all know, are painfully aware, who owns and who is responsible for maintaining what exists. And candidly, we have very little stormwater infrastructure, you know, in Garrett Park, when you look at the map. And then the same question applies to whose responsibility is it to add additions to the system, and then who's responsible for that ongoing. As you know, we've had discussions.
And when the system fails, whose responsibility is it to make it work?
Right. You know, when you may recall, I think at one point we shared kind of a map, or at least I know Jason did something, you know, there's some information available on the county site. But, you know, we've had discussions with the county that lasted more than a year. As you all know, we talked about back in December, we are at an impasse with that. We have engaged litigation counsel. You have an upcoming closed session briefing before your March meeting at 6 o'clock. So, you know, I don't know that you have to, you know, twist yourself into a pretzel until you have that briefing with them.
But they're going to give us their best
Right.
assessment of what's possible.
They will.
They're not going to tell us anything about the costs.
They can't,
Oh, you mean the
no,
cost
they
of-
can
of
tell you, they can
maintaining it?
tell
Oh.
you, yeah, they can tell you,
Right, I know.
they can give you an estimate of what it will cost, because there's some steps that, you know, I'm not trying to get too much into closed session
What
stuff. but-
litigation would cost,
They-
not the cost of the actual.
Right, right, and they have been,
Right.
and they have been asked to provide that to you.
Right.
You know, and there are obviously steps between where we are now and actually litigation that they will also discuss with you as, you know, strategy options. So that is the big unknown. What I wanted to kind of share with you on this slide, so this was as of January 31st, 2024. These are the balances that were on the January financial report. You have two accounts. One is account 28.2, which is labeled storm drains, and then we have another capital planning account, which is 32.2. Combined, that's about $176,000. Following your retreat, back at the end of October, I had this would need to be refined, but I had a brief conversation with Jason Azar to say, hey, if they wanted, there was discussion about doing, there's still this big question mark, but if we wanted to do kind of some kind of assessment, master plan, whatever you wanted to call it, of stormwater issues in Garrett Park, to know what's here, what shape it's in, what's missing, what would that likely cost? That's showing we have $21,000 in that account. Jason said you're probably looking in the range of 100,000.
Right.
Everyone is aware.
Just for an assessment,
Just for an assessment.
not to do any work.
No. And so even if you look,
Just to know what we don't know.
Right.
yeah, I mean, I think that I'm not telling you all anything you don't know, but you don't get away with doing a stormwater project probably in less than 6 digits. You just don't.
Right.
There has been discussion of one project, if most of you in the room are familiar with it. A homeowner who, it's a single property for the most part, experiencing repeated
Is
flooding
that the Porcupine Woods?
near there. Yeah, it's a house near.
Across the street.
Yeah. I will tell you that $176,000 is probably in the ballpark of what that one project alone will cost.
Are we liable for, I
Well,
mean,
no, we're not
that-
saying we're liable. We're not saying. So
We're
this
not
is,
going to talk about that right
right,
now.
right. So
Okay.
this is a different this all ties
This
back
is an
to.
order of magnitude.
Right, I'm just trying to give you a
Right.
sense of how expensive stormwater
Right.
how many
projects
of
can be.
those?
We don't
conditions do
we
have?
don't know because we
We
don't have an
We,
assessment.
because we don't have a plan.
Yeah, I mean, Jason and I met with some other residents, I don't know, sometime in the last 6 months. And their initial, and well, at least it's in the vicinity of your new home, okay?
Yeah. Got it,
And
yeah.
so there, and I think it's just, what people understand and what they don't understand. So their idea was, hey, we have this water coming down, slap in a stormwater inlet. And what Jason and I were saying, but it's not just an inlet, there's a pipe that has to lead someplace. And in
And
this
water's got to go somewhere.
right, and in this
Right.
particular location, there's no inlet, there's no piping, and the piping would probably connect to the apartment, private property. And what would likely happen, and what almost inevitably happens, is you have to go through the process of getting a private property owner, but that pipe would have to be upsized. And if you are well, Lisa, you did all your work in development, Stephen's familiar with this. If you are the triggering event for upsizing it, you pay the entire cost of all
Right.
that. And any private property owner that we would need to do work on is going to expect something from us.
Right.
So
Well,
once again, I think you'll have a
it might
better.
be a trade-off because you're solving their water problem too.
Yeah, so I think you'll have a better sense of this after you have the closed session. I don't think that's necessarily going to bring some finality to it, but I think, I think as you all have been talking about and clearly have an understanding of, what we have currently set aside for stormwater, should it end up being our problem,
Is almost nothing.
is almost nothing.
Right.
That's
Well,
100%
and the
correct.
flip side of this whole thing too is the fact that even if by some whatever, they say, oh, yes, we're gonna take over lock, stock and barrel, they're not gonna do anything
Right.
for one. I mean.
No. We'll be
Right.
in a 20-year
that's- yeah.
list.
So
Yeah,
we'll end up
At the
maybe
bottom.
like, was it, I think Chevy Chase where it's like,
Right.
hey.
it was Chevy Chase Village, yeah.
We'll give you some money in exchange for you.
Well, and what
They
Chevy
would
Chase,
work.
what Chevy Chase Village did, is they're using their ARPA money, and they've never done this before because they are under the county system. The county has
Mhm.
responsibility there. But they have this one block, they've never done it before. They told me that they probably don't plan to ever do this again, but they have this one block where people's backyards after a heavy rain almost still have standing water a week later. They are using their ARPA money, but basically they're paying for it, but once again, they're putting in piping that the county had to approve. It's a connection to a county system. And the county, understandably, from an engineering standpoint, is going to say, what is the impact of all this water suddenly going in all the way through? So once again, this is just more, I think, included because it has been something you all talked about. And I think it's certainly, depending on where this ends up, will impact your priorities and what funding you need to allocate.
But there's also we have nowhere near enough money available that even if we put every penny into storm drainage,
well,
if we were to need to do that, it wouldn't be enough.
well,
So,
if we needed a bond issue,
Right,
that would be a
but the-
reason to get a bond issue.
but
But then we might have two if we already have.
But I would also say there are a lot of infrastructure related grants tied to stormwater.
And federal especially, I'm sure.
Yeah, there
Yeah.
are. So I think the biggest issue here is to sort of, I think just be cognizant of this issue. You probably will have a fairly robust discussion in March with litigation counsel. That doesn't mean you have to make a decision that night, but I guess this is just sort of the cautionary note that if this ends up, you either choose to have it be in the town's bailiwick or you end up with it in the bailiwick, funding is an issue and funding becomes a matter of what's available and what are your priorities.
And getting an assessment would be a good first step to know what even we're talking
Right.
about.
Other thing that you've talked about, and this will be less painful, I promise you, I think.
Can I just
yeah,
back on one
sure.
thing on that one though?
Yeah.
Well, one thing is a question is, are we jeopardizing ourselves if we go ahead and do like a study now, get Clark Azar to do one in 2024? Does that make it seem like you own it when we?
That's
saying
one of
we
the
don't-
questions that we can.
Yeah,
ask
I think
next-
it's possibly, I think it's a
next-
good question, Stephen, but what I would say is in our discussions with, and it was county DOT staff, there was someone from the executive's office there as well, participating. One of the things that they used as a counter argument was the fact that the town has this funding. And they said, see, we've pulled your budgets, you've been setting aside money. That's a sign, Garrett Park, that you know this is your responsibility.
Okay.
Well, but the flip side, which I was just saying earlier, is that we would also we might have to go to them with money to do the work.
Yeah, I
Right.
mean, I think, I think there's a lot of strategy questions that you all are gonna need to answer.
But even so, what I'm thinking is, we still may have to put money into the budget, just given the fact that if we want to get any work done anytime soon, we would
Right.
have to have
Yeah,
some funds available.
And
correct.
also go after the sources of money that are
Yeah.
out there.
And one of the things that I know Joanna and I have talked about, and I think it probably was in the, my manager's report from December. People can have drainage problems on their property. I would say that most governmental entities don't just assume because you have a problem on your property that it is a governmental responsibility. Typically, so I think as this issue unfolds, however it unfolds, there would need to be a very clear policy, and I would caution you against taking on what is a private property issue versus what is a stormwater issue because water is being channeled from a public road. Because everyone can have
Or
drainage.
park.
Right, everyone can have drainage problems, but unless the water problem is stemming from public infrastructure, most municipalities, most counties do not touch it. Because that is just,
Opens a can of worms.
it's problematic.
Yeah, that's the industry standard. I
right.
took infrastructure planning in grad school, and it's one of the first things they teach you is all properties are supposed to be responsible for themselves, and if
Yeah.
it makes something worse, then it's their responsibility. So
Yeah, I mean, let's
Yeah.
face it, I mean, almost probably all of us who've owned a number of houses. You can have French drains, you can do
Mhm.
regrading on your property, you put in swales, so there's a lot of things that,
But the water's got to go somewhere.
right.
but
But I think
necessarily the town.
It's not necessarily,
Right.
not all
Town
water
problem.
issues, I guess what I'm
Correct.
saying is not all drainage issues are a governmental
Yeah,
responsibility.
Right.
and that's
I feel
where
like-
we've gotten ourselves into trouble is there have been some government actions that work
There
on
have
a
been.
lot of private property and it's.
In going
it's
back
not-
through
still
some
not
of
fixed.
the history, and Ron Bolt certainly, was, and Jason were both very helpful. I think there are certainly instances where, at least based on what little I know, and I'm not going to say I have the complete picture, but at least the appearance is that the town interjected itself into what would commonly be considered a private property problem to resolve.
So I think that we're gonna know a lot more
We
after
will,
March
so,
11th.
yeah,
So,
I'm gonna
so
move on.
I
Okay.
kind of, yeah, I
Yeah.
think,
So.
The other thing to keep in mind is that this isn't a cliff and a one-year problem.
It's not.
We have like we have plenty of time to stretch this out and
Yeah.
start to address it and start to make a plan and
Yes.
start to see
Yeah.
what happens with the weather and sources of funding and a lot of other things. So
Yeah,
I just think it's important that we don't have a hard date
no,
that this is all going to be in our laps.
no, and I think certainly.
yeah, we're not
y-
getting
y-
a bill.
no,
Right.
Well, we're not Annapolis. I mean, I'm just
Gentle
thinking,
cliff.
I'm thinking of like Annapolis, which is, think about what you see as the reports on the city dock and other places. I grew up in Virginia Beach, clearly lots of problems. Yeah, I mean, the southern part of the county certainly has drainage issues, stormwater issues are very common. We are not at the same point as some other jurisdictions that are, at sea level. Just kind of very quickly, we don't have to really discuss this that much, but you all did talk about as one of your priorities, renovating or redesigning Cambria Park and some of the surrounding open spaces. There is no funding currently allocated to this project. I think one is, once we're, you want to get closer to moving forward on this, I think certainly there would be some further refinement of the scope. I mean, you had a very limited period of time to talk about your priorities. I did want to flag for you all, though, that the Maryland Community Parks and Playgrounds Program, which is the grant funding source for Yendel, would be a possible source of project funding. Obviously, that's a competitive grant application process. If it's something that you all are interested in pursuing, I think given the other things that you're interested in, I think that program is something at least we should probably take a shot at getting funding
Yeah, you did a
through.
great job on Yendel.
I mean, at least I understand it better. So what will happen is, for the state fiscal year 2026 funding cycle, the application deadlines are in August every year. So once again, you don't need to decide that tonight, but if this is something you're interested in pursuing, we should start having discussions within the next couple months about what you specifically want as part of this project, so that we could get a good head start.
Because we don't have a design or anything yet, or
Yeah,
a
I mean,
budget or anything.
Yeah, but I mean, we could pursue funding, for design. We
Right.
could, so there's a number of different ways to handle
Right.
this. And I think Stephen's experience with park design, would be very informative, I think, in terms of just, possibly estimating cost based on what you all are considering. He would probably have a better sense of that than I would. So I think at least with this priority, there's at least an avenue of funding, that's readily identifiable. The program's been around forever. So with that, that's really all. I mean, I'm glad we had some good discussion as we were going along, but, this is really kind of your time. I'm going to take this down so anyone there can actually probably see you all. Well, I guess anyone watching can actually see you all talking, right, Kayla? But basically my suggested discussion points, but I think you should take this meeting in whatever direction you want. I would encourage you, though, to really kind of talk a little bit about capital projects and, kind of what your priorities are. You may not resolve it tonight. At least from a formatting standpoint, I would appreciate some feedback. Like I said, I recognize I probably couldn't have put more disclaimers saying preliminary rough, something draft. Because there's certainly things that I know, like we're probably going to need to do something with the playground. It's a cost share thing with the nursery school, but that probably is sometime within the next 5 years. I've talked to the nursery school. The same program we just talked about is also a possible source for that. The equipment at Cambria is in good shape. But we do want to start putting these things kind of.
Porcupine Woods is in good shape. I mean,
Yeah, there's
the
some
park,
minor projects like
Yeah.
the bridge replacement things I've talked to the guys about. But I think getting a better handle of, you obviously haven't seen numbers. You don't know how much is going to be available for capital. But at least I think one is, am I on the right track in terms of what you envisioned in terms of a document that was readable and, usable? So I would encourage you to have some discussion on capital. And then if you do have some guidance on the real and personal property tax rates, if you tell me this evening, the rates are staying the same, that at least allows me, as I'm building, a budget draft or a budget proposal for you for April, to use those tax rates to calculate, revenue estimates. And then the other thing, and you've made some requests as we've gone along, but if there's specific follow-up information that you want me to provide, which I would be surprised if you didn't, the more you can kind of help me know what it is you're going to want, I can go ahead and start preparing that and shooting it to you. So with that, I'm going to shut up and let you all talk.
So I would like to start with the committee requests,
okay,
because we have it right in front of us and it's kind of an easy thing we can check off. Start with Arboretum. So Arboretum has several line items. But we're consolidating them to one?
Yeah, they were asking, Jerry can help, 110,000, I think, and then the separate funding for the one account.
Right, there are two, so
So we're gonna
Arboretum
eliminate
currently
capital.
has 4, 2 in capital and 2 in operating. The idea is to consolidate to 2 in operating. And one budget line item pays for the arborist work and
Yeah.
sort of programming and committee costs, if say they were to print a brochure or something, it would, or for other educational materials, it would come out of that, but mostly pays for the arborists and some of the work to track the tree work. And then the other line item is the trees, parks and ground, and that's the big one where what used to come out of capital,
Yeah.
we've upped that dollar amount to cover pruning, removals, and planting of new trees.
So the amount of request for the operating for
It-
line 13.5
It's
takes
100.
into consideration that it used to be somewhere else.
It used to be split partially in capital and partially in operating.
Yeah,
But it used to be 73 and now it's gonna be 125.
yeah, it'd be 100. I think a couple things I would just mention, obviously this year we had about $20,000 in cost for doing some work on the grotto property. So that's probably why they dropped it a little bit from the 110. You are in the process, I would just note, in allocating additional funding, that so we can, make sure we do Strathmore, the pruning, we do Cambria Park. So this year will be fairly intensive, but I think the committee's budget of about $100,000, I think is reasonable. Do you agree, Cheryl?
think so.
Yeah.
So just so I understand, where's the money? Does this $100,000 include the trees that we're replacing on Waverly?
No, that would be a capital project budget.
Okay, is it in a capital, is it somewhere right now, or is it just sitting in a pot of
It
money?
would be considered part of the sidewalk project
Okay,
budget.
It's an accessory of that project.
Right.
actually.
okay. So we would have to move money from the capital budget to the sidewalk budget?
You do have funding in a sidewalk line item now.
Okay.
So I think
32.
what becomes very confusing is this issue with the ARPA funding and our trying to move money
Right,
back and
right,
forth
right.
to build more flexibility for town hall. But there is funding in a sidewalk line item now
To
that will be
replace the trees
to-
and plant them?
for everything with Waverly.
Okay.
Everything.
Is that
Right.
32.3?
Right.
Lights.
It's very small.
What'd you say, Todd?
32.3 it's a sidewalk planning.
Yeah,
$1,000.
that's another, candidly, typically when we're doing a sidewalk project, it all just sort of, the engineering gets rolled in. So yeah, you look up ahead, Todd, at the very,
26.2?
yes,
Oh, that's the big one.
yeah.
Okay.
So one of the reasons why you may have noticed on the sort of draft CIP, I put a to be determined under sidewalks for FY 2026. Jason thinks there's one stretch of sidewalk that may need some work in either 26 or 27. He was not able to get out here to review it and probably won't be out here until the week of March 11th. But I was trying to flag for you all that there may be additional sidewalk work coming up in the next couple of years besides Waverly.
Okay.
Two questions for you. The first one is line 13.5, got the big description here, but about in the middle of 13.5, the line starts with established in the period, but it says the Strathmore Knolls elevation by itself is estimated to cost $25,000, but is expected to be covered under the current unexpended balance of the account, 32,000.
Yeah, so let me help you there. So if you look at what I did for Sean Conlon, who is the chair, if you go back to the operating budget and you look at 13.5. So that line item has a budget of 146,000. There are a number of items in there besides trees. There's a few other tangential items that are operating costs. So what I had done for Sean is say, okay, we had set aside $110,000. There was $90,000 that the committee had recommended last year we put in the operating budget. And then there was an additional 20,000 that we put in for the grotto. So that's kind of where Sean is picking up the 110. I went through and took out of that 110 what we paid for the grotto, which is very close to $20,000. Backed off what we've paid Empire, what we've paid Bartlett. So the work we've already had done this fiscal year. So the roughly 32,000 Sean is referring to of what is left of that $110,000 allocation with all the bills we've already paid this year. So what I had said to Sean is we've got roughly $33,000 left in the operating budget. I've got a cost of, roughly 20 to 25,000 for Strathmore once we finally get this darn MOU signed. We're getting close. And basically it's the spring tree planting. And then in budget amendment number 2, I asked you all for an additional funding of roughly $20,000 to do the work at Cambria Park. So basically that, I was trying to walk Sean through.
Was that the wood chips and all of that? Cambria
There's just a
Park?
bunch of like invasive trees. There's a bunch of like 30 kind of smaller invasive trees and things like
Okay.
that. So that's what, when Sean is referring to the unexpended balance, he's referring to the operating side of things.
And we will have that.
In this current fiscal.
In this
at
current fiscal year.
And we will expend it by this current
Yeah,
fiscal year.
that is my, yeah.
So we don't need to ask for more. next
Right,
year.
That-
yeah. Right, so Cambria Park, truthfully, I could sign the Empire thing tomorrow. Empire, we just got a quote for Yendel, but Yendel will be booked as a project cost because that's part of what I included in the state grant. That part of it was, property site cleanup, removal of invasives. So take Yendel out of the equation because it's on the capital side. Strathmore, where we are, just so you know, I'm a little bit behind in reviewing the latest version of the MOU, which is dated February 15th. We had a couple exchanges of drafts since your meeting in January. They have included language in the latest version of the MOU that the state will pay for any removal of, like they just picked up the language I sent them, which I'm not sure was the best, but it was like dying, disease,
Right.
dead, or
Tree.
struck by a vehicle, and that's exactly what they included. So the state has said that they will pay for that.
Oh, great.
So overall, is Arboretum asking,
Arboretum's asking for a total of 116,000.
Right.
so when we look
Split into
at,
two categories.
okay,
The capital is all crossed out. It's a little confusing.
I think Sean was trying to draw his own mind through what happened and explain it to the
Right.
committee because
Yeah.
I had given him historical trends, which had to pick up everything.
okay, so
So,
so Arboretum is asking for 116,000, which is 10,000 less than what we have budgeted for them in this current budget.
yeah,
year.
And that's because that big chunk
Yeah.
for Strathmore will get taken care of this year.
yeah, and the grotto won't be there.
Right,
again.
so what are y'all,
Can we,
Sure.
the one thing I was asked, can we make it like a 13.8 and split the trees out because it gets muddy with what's.
Yeah, so what happens, so is I have in my personal budget notes of where I come up with things, I'll put. There's actually subcategories. So truthfully, we have more subcategories than I think I have ever seen anyplace, but there's like a 13.5A and a 13.5A1. And so from a accounting standpoint, like the overall budget, if you look at 13.5 is now 146,000. But there is a breakdown of that I keep internally to track how I came up with my number. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah,
does that satisfy your concern?
Yeah.
or I can tell you how I
When I
came up
get
with it.
visibility of that, it's possible, it's, that's the reason why I'm asking for it, is because if you look
Yeah.
at it, it's on this, point line item, and so to make it less muddy.
We can do it. I mean, I think that I would also say, Phil, that in my experience, sometimes, and I think it's always the challenge in terms of what you depict, whether it's a CIP or an operating budget. There are going to be those people, and certainly you all have a different area of interest than other people do, because it's, you're overseeing the budget, it's your budget. Sometimes the more subcategories you get, the more the average user gets a little lost in the whole thing because it just becomes a little unwieldy. So I'm happy to give you whatever you want. I can talk to Mary, but I would just say the more subline items you add, because they don't have a specific allocation formal, well, they're not part of your adopted budget because you adopt at that level. You don't adopt at the sub level.
Right.
Does that make sense?
No, exactly.
I think if there's particular accounts that you're interested in, and if you have any, there might be a different way of providing that information, and I'm happy to do that.
As a follow-on to that question, though, that does make me curious. We're currently using contract support for some of the mowing services.
We are.
Are we putting that in this line item?
It is. Yes,
That's why I was wondering about it. I wondered, like, would it actually be helpful in the long run, like, if you just made it just trees only, arboretum related, and then you had grounds separate, because then could you then get away with all those subcategories? You might
You know,
clean up the accounting.
it also might help with tax duplication. If it's,
You know, truthfully, with the county, the way they look at it, I'll give you the example of roads. They don't really care what we actually spend. What they care about is they basically average their 3-year cost for maintaining a certain classification of roads. And then they just take that average 3-year cost, and it's a rolling 3-year average. And they apply it to your lane miles. There's a provision if you happen to have a bridge, which, you know, thank God we don't have one. But yeah, it wouldn't help us. What I would say is, I think the advantage of having the sub-accounts in Mary's accounting system, though they don't show up here, is when Sean Conlon wanted me to give him numbers. I'm not having to sort out what we paid a contractor for mowing. I'm not having to sort out what we pay WSSC for pulling meters and things, because each of those things, it was very easy to take the specific accounts that I needed and do a spreadsheet for Sean.
so when we,
But if we have separate accounts here, you would have to ask permission of the council, right, to move between sub-accounts, which could be.
Yeah, I mean, I think the way,
Yes.
but the existing policy basically rolls up to, if you're looking at the operating budget, everything rolls up. So if you look at the things that are underlined, so town
Okay.
committees as a whole, yes, that's the
Within
existing
those.
policy that you all have.
We at the whole digit level, we adopted the
Yep.
whole digit level.
Right.
Okay,
Not the point.
okay. that's
Yeah,
fair.
so what I would say is just think about what additional information you might want. I can talk to Mary about whether that's a, you know, a financial report issue, or there's like, you know, a supplemental report. I would just need to have a better sense of what accounts you want that level of detail for. It's certainly there.
so since 13.5 is not just for trees and arboretum things and other things, that means that if we say we want to approve $100,000 or 116,000 for the Arboretum Committee, when it actually shows up in the budget, it will be more than that, because it will take into consideration additional monies for mowing and any other work.
Right. Yeah, I mean, so what I do in my own, and I think I might have, I don't know if I did it either last year or the year before. Those of you who were here would remember this. I actually sent you my Excel spreadsheet with my own notes to myself
Mhm.
of how I rolled numbers up to that level. In 13.5, I don't do it for every one of them because some of them are fairly simple. I did it for 13.5 because I didn't want to lose track of how I arrived in this example at the 146,000. It was my back calculations, if you will, to
So-
get to the budget that gets presented to you.
So I'm gonna guess that we're gonna need another work session. I'm gonna guess that that's gonna be desirable, or more
Yeah.
conversation about this. But I would like to sort of try to get some
Yep.
things conceptual. So what do you all think about
Well,
this?
one last
Yeah, I'm
thing,
sorry.
sorry.
No, no, no.
But, wouldn't Phil be under professional fees? instead
Well,
of-
he's been, you know, some of
I
it,
mean, I don't care.
yeah,
I don't know.
I think because, yeah, it's an interesting question, Phil, and I've kind of in many cases mirrored what was.
Okay.
Phil Normandy, it definitely is a professional fee for whatever reason, you know, and Phil's been doing work for the town and there was someone before him. He's always been charged to 12.1. Because I think his role was viewed, I'm guessing, as being, you know, very tied to arboretum management, and that's certainly the case. So yeah, it is a professional fee. I will tell you, he's issued a 1099 as a vendor for the town. But you're correct. I think when I look at Phil's qualifications, I mean, they're certainly unique, but it's a professional fee just the same way that Ron Bolt is, just the same way that, you know, a variety of other services that we use are.
Is Claire?
Claire is actually charged to archive, so it's very similar
Yeah.
to
So
how Phil
more-
is charged.
Whereas legal fees or engineering is
Yeah,
not tied. to the
yeah, so
committee.
engineering for the most part is going to be tied to a capital project. When we use Grove Slade, that was budgeted in professional fees. But we have been consistent in the way we've handled where Claire gets booked versus where Phil Normandy gets booked.
All right. How do you all feel about the Arboretum request for $116,000?
Sounds good.
Okay, so that's,
I'm
good with it.
Yeah,
Great, thank you.
Great. The next one is the archives. The request is for $25,659. This is, I believe, isn't this a reduction? Is this a little bit of? a-
Sounds lower.
I had asked whether or not, did we ever find out whether or not she needed, any additional dehumidifier,
Fire stuff.
air conditioner?
Yeah, I need to talk to her because we have been, we have attempted a couple things down there, so let me touch base with Claire.
I asked her about it at the last meeting
Yeah.
and she said she thought that the equipment that she already had was in place. Because she said sprinklers and water damages the archives materials more than potentially other ways to
Yeah.
deal with a fire. She didn't think that doing more for fireproofing. the
Yeah, typically a lot of
archives
times you will
was
have
good
a
idea.
record and records related things you don't
Her
have
biggest
for.
thing is having the equipment to play the archives material in the right format because it's all changing so quickly.
Yeah,
I'm trying to get it all ported to some
yeah.
common
One of the
standard.
discussion points I had with Claire, she, you may remember in Budget Amendment 2 that's currently pending, and for those of you who have more tenure, you'll probably remember last year's mid-year budget adjustment. We actually reduced some funding, and I asked Claire about that because obviously Claire has a full-time job. And I said, look, you know, we'll take whatever hours we can get. You're wonderful, but should we be budgeting for this many hours for you? Because you haven't been able to hit it the last, you know, during my tenure. She feels like that's something she will be able to do. So I do think, I mean, it's a slight increase over where it is right now. I think, like I say, I think there's a lot of thought that goes into how this budget gets put together. So
Seems reasonable.
yeah.
So how do we feel about the $25,669?
Sounds good.
Okay.
Good.
And historic preservation has requested $4,000.
Actually, 3,000, Joanne. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm reading the wrong one. It is 4,000. I was reading
4,000, right.
top down. It is 4,000.
Um,
And that's for the Chevy house.
It's a couple things. They're continuing to work on the walking tour, and Stephen can probably speak to that better than I can.
That's what Nancy proposed, right? Nancy
Yeah.
Wall's memo. Yeah.
Right, and they typically will do walking tours or something else, so.
Yeah, I'm good with it.
Sounds
I'm
good.
good with it, but I do have a question or comment question also. Revise, is that a software?
That's our website.
That's our website.
That's
Okay.
the website provider. They've been very good to us.
Yeah.
Early July.
Trying to
Okay.
figure out what makes sense for a walking tour, and a lot of that is going through Kayla trying to figure out like how it could translate on the website can be usable, so. It's just not as easy as it sounds.
Whether it could be merged with the tree inventory that's on the website.
That's one of the things we're
So
considering.
people could see both the trees and historic properties as they walk along.
That hasn't been a point of conversation that I had with Nancy Walls, who's chair of HPC. My initial reaction, and this is truly an initial reaction, having only heard this idea 30 seconds ago.
Okay.
I have brought it up in the past, I know.
Yeah, I've talked about it with Nancy and the committee too. Yeah.
I think there are potential possibilities, but I would be concerned about adding complexity to a GIS map because that tree inventory is not maintained by town staff. That is a volunteer affiliated with Arboretum who has built that and who has added that. It's something that if you're truly interested in, we can look at pursuing further. But without having a chance to pick the brain of the volunteer who built that map, I don't want to commit too much one way or another. My background is not in GIS. I did what I had to do in grad school and then I put it behind me.
Well, one thing, Jerry, or somebody could ask Nancy about it as a first step.
Well, how far along are you in developing your walking tour?
We're trying to figure out what to do on it, because it was something I just threw out as an idea probably like 6 years ago, and originally the idea was that you could do an app where people might, get it, and as they walk around the town would move around, you'd be able to click on things to see more information, but then things have kind of changed. Nobody really downloads apps as much anymore, so trying to see like what we could do with Kayla's help and Revise's help to like get something where you might be able to click a QR code or know where the location is on the website on the town, but then get it where it would just be on the town website, whether on a desktop or walking around with your phone with the dog, but then it's like a pretty big range of what you could do when you're on there, and that's what we're trying to figure out is like, what's the background for the map? Is it something that moves, or is it just static? Is it just historic things? Is it also town amenities? Is it also the trees? Like the more of those complexity things get added on, it may get out of hand. And we're just not sure how many people would really use it either, so. We know there would be at least a dozen people really interested, but I don't know if it would be more than a dozen, so.
So that's what, $840 per person. in New York
Yeah,
City.
so that's
Well,
the trick.
I have no
So-
problem with the $4,000 budget. It seems to me there's the opportunity both for the synergy of people being able to look up both trees and houses at the same, historic properties at the same time, and maybe make use of something the town is already paying for, its GIS software license and everything. But we don't have to work that out right now.
Yeah, that's kind of that's one of the things I thought it was, yeah.
So my idea for how to approach the capital budget as a whole was kind of to scrub it and make it blank and say, here's the amount of money. And rather than feel obliged to just keep, because in the past, we have money left over. Okay, let's put a little bit here, let's put a little bit there, and see what the different categories are and subcategories, and just kind of put a little here and there. And it doesn't ever amount to anything that is actionable. So my idea was kind of, let's pretend we're not obligated. Now, that's not to say that we're not going to do things. It's not to say that we're not going to whatever. It just means I don't want to be beholden to that in terms of determining what the funding level should be. So if we kind of think of it as, we have this pot of money, and what are the things that we absolutely know are going to be ongoing expenses? For example, I think Barb did this with attachment 3. She refers to equipment, and we know that we should set aside some money in our capital funding or capital budget for equipment. And we know we should we will need to spend in this next fiscal year money on streets and curbs. So she's sort of taken that pot of money and done the first steps of allocation on our behalf, and then left the more subjective items blank. I think, Barb, is that
Yeah,
a
I
good
mean,
interpretation of?
Yeah, so what, to try to just give you something, at least one, I needed to give you a format so you could tell me if I'm on the right track. So I talked to the guys about what they see coming up in terms of just, equipment and facility related things. And what I would say regarding facilities is, I think we're all aware, there are exterior issues at Penn Place that keep getting kicked down the path, and George is getting just concerned, because we're not investing in some of the things in the building. So I did not include his Penn Place, his town hall number for citing. But I talked to the guys and, tried to fill in what I envisioned in this 5-year period, with the exception of town hall. Obviously, we had Clark Azar do an assessment of roads back in 2022. I think it was 2022, maybe early 2023. I asked them to come back out and to basically check current conditions of roads. That's where you'll notice, some of you may remember that we have road work planned this year, which may either hit, but I think right now we're just assuming, given the bid schedule for this mega bid, as I call it, that work will probably hit FY 2025 more than FY 2024.
And that's the 342?
Right. So that we picked up basically Cambria, which was not on the original list we talked about last year. The other thing, and you may not agree with me, but I've gone ahead and added it in. So if you don't, now's probably a good time to tell me. I think when we're doing road projects and it makes sense, is to invest in concrete curbs, because when you use asphalt curbs, they're less expensive, but all it takes is one snowstorm and it hit with a plow, and they're toast. They're toast. So I also had, many of you know John Strong, he's with Clark Azar, works very closely with Jason. He came out in 2023 because he had done the road assessment, kind of assessed the curbs, and so as you're looking at the streets and curbs number, these are reflective of road projects where concrete curbs could be installed at the same time. And then, as I said, Jason needs to come out in the next couple of weeks and look at the stretch of sidewalk. So I feel good about, the equipment and, the equipment number. There's some guesswork still involved with, I need to walks, but I was trying to give you, I think the numbers are, based on what they gave me. And what's in the plan currently. Obviously, you typically assess your roadways on your sidewalks annually. Sometimes you can get more years out of a road, and we're certainly not going to do it early if we don't have to. I think the part that's, missing, is, one is I didn't want to get too far into this if you hated the format, to be honest with you. But yes, we're starting to get into areas where there is some policy decisions here in terms of what do you want to see go forward, and trying to assign some numbers to those.
Where's the Cambria?
Cambria is not a funded project right now.
Oh, it's not on here
It's
at
not-
all.
Well, it's not currently funded, so,
Street
Paving
Okay.
of Cambria.
streets and curbs.
oh yeah, I'm sorry, yeah, Cambria,
Oh.
not the park, but in streets and curbs. Thank you.
Okay.
Sorry, Lisa, I
So
misunderstood.
then why 653? Like, that's a really big number. Is that?
I
because
can
we
I can
anticipate-
break it down for you. So I don't have that with me, but it's something, I can send you the document from Clark Azar.
But is that just assuming that 5 years from now, 4 years from now, we will have to do a major rehaul of streets and curbs?
There are specific streets and curbs
That will come due.
that based on current assessments that we think will come due during that timeframe.
Well, the biggest number is in the first year.
Yeah, the biggest actually is 2029. But yeah, basically so why don't when I'll put on my to-do list, or Kayla, if you can help me. I can send you the working documents that I got from Clark Azar, and which these numbers are based on. I took the numbers they gave me for roads and concrete curbs, added in 10% for, engineering related, the package work, site inspections, things like that. So you'll see the numbers that based on what I'll give you.
So the streets and curbs numbers are based on, we've got a cycle of when roads and when curbs will be ready mathematically, even if conditions may give us an extra year
Right.
but mathematically.
This could be stretched out, but I
Okay.
think we're within a year or two of probably what they have in their plan. So what you'll see in the documents I send you is they assigned which is very common. You assign a rating scale to pavement conditions.
Yeah.
And then obviously, as you trend out, you have to make certain assumptions about, cost and how they trend up. But you'll be able to actually see the specific roads on what these numbers were based on. One thing I'll just mention is you kind of just try to get your arms around everything. And if this was tied to the question Jerry Lee asked at the February meeting, is obviously, we have highway user revenue. So, don't forget that pot of funding, when we don't have an eligible project, is being reserved, and you can unreserve it when you have projects. So
this doesn't really address sources of funds. It's just
does not.
uses of
it's
funds.
just the source expenditures.
And
Right.
what we don't have here is the total amount available, which I guess we get from the other, I mean, in other words, to be meaningful, we need to know
It's-
in relative terms, how much we have so that we.
Right, and I think if you look at the unexpended funds on the January financial report,
Right.
I would kind of ignore the ARPA,
The
you
2 million,
The
2.4
181.
million?
right,
The 1.8.
yeah, and a lot of that though, obviously, I don't see you pulling money out of town hall.
Oh, it's a little.
But I think to Joanna's point, I think part of this, as you continue your discussions about the capital budget, there's obviously going to be the money in town hall. I don't see you all pulling money from that. So there's an unexpended balance, but that's a policy issue, but
not
all the
that much
discussion
money,
you've ever
right.
had, if you don't pull from it, then that money is sort of sacrosanct, and you need to look at
Right.
what is available in the other.
So the
accounts.
baseline is that sort of the amount we're looking at is 1.8 million per year, which is sort of the,
No, it's
that's how much
total.
money
oh,
we
that's the total.
Total.
I'm sorry.
And I think-
Okay.
Would it be fair to say that we put in like,
Goodness.
in a good year, like 300-400 to the
Yeah,
capital?
I mean, I think, obviously the income tax windfall in November changed everything. I would say from a initial budgetary standpoint, and admittedly, I'd rather you be surprised and pleasantly have money than, be hit with money not coming in. But typically you transfer somewhere around $200,000 at the, usually when you adopt the budget. That's left over after all the operating expenses are
Oh,
done.
it's only 200. I thought it was a little higher, but okay.
It can be, because what happens, Stephen, is if I miss the prior year carryover, which once
Yeah.
again, income taxes with the payment in June, balloon things.
And we just added more arboretum money to the.
Right, it
operating side
basically
too.
added more operating money that you then transfer. So, we're trying to refine the projection so it gets closer every year.
Mhm.
I think you can count on a minimum transfer in of $200,000 and then probably more than that.
If we leave
realistically.
the tax rate the same.
Mhm.
But a way
So-
to, but just super quick, like a way to think about what we talked about earlier with potential to like go for a bond financing for town hall is if you're putting like an extra 200, pumping 200 into capital per year, if you do that bond financing,
Yeah.
you could be spending a third or 2/3 of it.
Yeah,
right
I
off the
mean,
bat.
I would say realistically, and I could
Mhm.
certainly go back and look, it's like you say, it's been a matter of, refining the
That's good.
projections and trying to be
Mhm.
more accurate. $200,000 is probably low based on what we've done because we usually come in lower on expenses and higher on revenues. But you're right, Stephen, if, let's just say we use a $300,000 number and you bond $1 million and you have $75,000 of debt service, that 75,000 is no longer available for capital. So to Todd's point, there is an opportunity cost. There's no doubt about that.
And so just to clarify, the total amount already expended for town hall seems to be about 750, right?
713 expended or the amount that we've sort of mentally set aside?
I guess the amount at this point that we've expended, is it the 713 or is it 713 plus the other town hall item below? Remember the 55?
Yeah, no,
That's just planning.
713 is what we've set aside.
Side, yeah.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Plus the
Available
50,
funds. So look at the right column as what's available now,
and that's, okay,
It's 713 plus 55,000 for
plus the
So
order.
it's-
planning.
Right.
Right.
Planning.
so there we go, 760.
Yeah, so that goes back, Todd,
765.
to,
So that's already here.
that goes back to this slide, Todd, that after budget amendment 2 gets processed, we
Right.
have about just under $1.6 million set aside for town hall.
So Barbara, you gonna fill out the rest of this 2025
No,
to
that's what-
2029, all these
That's what I
numbers?
need your help to
Decide.
do.
Yeah, we have
Oh,
to
you need our
decide.
help.
So what we have is, if we take the unexpended capital funds as a base number of 1.81 million,
Okay,
and we take out the 713 for town hall.
Right.
Plus the
Plus
55.
the,
Yeah.
no,
There's 55 in town hall planning that we want to
Okay.
reserve. as well.
Yeah.
So it's 765, I said?
okay, so, so 430.
68.
So we're down, okay, and then we also get rid of, or we also sort of subtract out the equipment, the streets and roads, the sidewalks in Penn Place.
Yeah,
We get rid of all that, then we have $430,000 that is currently in the capital budget that we've been working on. But rather than say, well, we've already got, something, Yendel, we've got $79,000. Do we really want to spend? That's a bad example.
Yendo's a bad example because of the grant.
Okay, fine, IT
Yeah.
equipment.
I mean, what I would say with IT equipment, I'm scheduled to have a call today and just our schedules didn't align, but during my time here, which is very common, I mean, it's not something I'm doing. With the exception of probably the server, IT equipment these days is operational equipment, and that's what we have been doing. The server will obviously be a different thing. I have a call scheduled when I'm back from vacation with Island Joe to make sure we get the server in the right year. But everything else in terms of just the normal replacement of desktops and laptops is all on the operating side.
So
That could be a small number.
It'll be
then.
probably, yeah.
for an example.
What is utilities for? So 28.
That was the account, you may recall, that was money, it had been $108,000 until budget amendment 1 this year. That was money that was set aside to basically do something to move the utility poles in the Penn Place parking lot. You had a prior discussion about this, and what we ended up doing was the replacement poles that we purchased for Strathmore, if you remember.
right.
The lighting, we ended up, by the time it was all said and done, the purchase of those replacement poles ended up getting charged to ARPA. And then what you otherwise would have spent out of that account went to town hall. So I think the question is, it's being labeled as a utilities account is kind of a misnomer. Because that money sat, that $108,000 sat there for literally years and wasn't spent.
So, but conceptually,
You could,
you know,
you could move it, you could relabel it as lighting, because I know there's been some discussion about possibly changing out other lighting
But
fixtures.
it's still in the capital account.
It's in a capital.
In other words, it doesn't free up any space, which is kind of what you're getting at, right?
Well,
I mean, we
you can move it out of that line item.
we can say that it's
someplace
not a
else.
priority and we don't want to save that money and we can put it somewhere else.
Yeah.
So we have about $430,000. It's not play money, but it's money that we need to make policy decisions about where we want to put that money. What's your thought about getting rid of the capital planning section? Is that?
I think capital planning, when this probably falls very much into Stephen and Bill's realm. I consider, when I have used capital planning type accounts, I have typically used them quite often for, you talked about, I was using an example, not saying you want to do it, but like stormwater system, an assessment, an initial feasibility study for a building project where you're just really trying to get your arms around something.
But does that really need its own category or can that just be?
It can be rolled in. I mean, like we have money for like sidewalk planning. I think at this point, what will likely happen with sidewalks, for example, Jason's going to come out and look at this one stretch in a couple weeks. If those sidewalk needs, to me, the design and the other related engineering work is part of the capital project. I don't know that you need a capital line item unless you're, I'll give an example. Tacoma Park didn't have a lot of sidewalks. We had speed cameras. That's what we used the funding for. And there was like a big assessment of where should we be putting sidewalks. I mean, it literally was sort of a community-wide planning process for sidewalks. Yeah, I mean, I think two of the accounts, if you want to try to bang something out tonight, I'm not sure you're prepared to do that. And I don't think you
Might be
feel
okay.
compelled, is, I mentioned the Arboretum funding that because of the way we're doing things, and those would be account 29.2 and 32.4. Combined, it's roughly $75,000. That's money that I think should be zeroed out on the capital side. Those line items should be zeroed out and that funding should be moved someplace else.
You're just gonna delete those lines.
Right.
Yeah, they'll be taken down to, the fund, basically they'll be deleted and that funding goes someplace else, but I'm not sure at this juncture where you want it to go.
But we've already
what?
we've already,
It's in the,
Yeah, it's part of
it
your, it
doesn't free up any more
doesn't
space.
free up anything.
It's part of the 430.
it's part of the 430.
Right.
So one thing I like about how you did the part of attachment 3 was you kind of had a narrative.
Yeah,
And I think that's probably a pretty important piece to
It
putting
is.
together a capital improvement program. And that is sort of maybe how we could get away with getting rid of the capital planning and having it be like, hey, this is for storm drains and we don't need a separate storm drain thing. We've got it in our narrative. Maybe it's just visually makes it seem less daunting, but it doesn't change. I mean, that's a policy. So with this 430, do we need to put money in for the community center? I'm sorry.
Ask a quick
Sure.
question, 2 questions, but they're related. The 430 that we're talking about right now.
Yeah.
That essentially says we zeroed out the contingency or do we leave it alone?
Yeah, that includes zeroing out the contingency. So let's start there.
And so
Can-
that was my next question.
can I
How much do we set off?
well, and can I remind you of something? And I apologize. I did not bring my February a packet with me and I can take the screen down and grab it, but as a reminder, with budget amendment 2, we're putting about $200 and some thousand more into contingency as part of budget amendment 2. That was a conscious recommendation on my part to buy you flexibility of where do you want those funds to go?
So we don't actually, it's not 430, we have 630.
Correct.
So we actually have 630, not 430.
Yeah, I mean, would it be helpful to you all, and obviously, I'm trying to think what bills we've been paying recently, but, I mean, pretty soon you'll have the February report, but there's not that many capital bills. I think the only one that I recall processing in February, there were some,
We had the
Wiedemann-
doors for the post office.
right, there were the doors and there were some Wiedemann charges, for
And that
concept
was for
four,
town hall.
concept four, as well as some work on the office. Would it be helpful for me to, you know, like I say, it could be slightly off, but to take the unexpended capital funds column, I could just hide everything else because, and basically add on the amounts that would be there after budget amendment 2 is processed. And those funds are in the right place. Would that be helpful?
Well,
to
it just
see?
adds 200,000, right?
Yeah,
That's
that's
the
about 200,000.
practical effect, right?
That's the practical effect. And it
Okay.
adds funding to the town hall, which we have already talked about.
This is, okay, so it's the same as what we had last
Yeah,
month, which would be,
right.
yeah, we moved 231,
It'll be slightly less than that because of upping the community center. It's like within $8,000, I feel. So, yeah.
So it's about 650 that we have.
But we now, so it'd be, and the question really got down to, I know we moved that there, but is how much do we want to leave in contingency?
So that was money that we moved, and instead of deciding in the budget amendment where in particular we were gonna put it in the capital budget, in order for us to have maximum flexibility so that we could talk about it here.
Right. It got put in contingency. So you could allocate.
Like
it.
a
But that's
Is that the rainy day fund?
What's already there.
Do we have a
But
bank?
I'm saying.
Do we have investments?
Right. And what I would, if I can.
We should have some money in contingency.
Everyone,
Regardless of where.
Yes.
So once again,
All right, let's talk a minute about
can
contingency.
I ask you, so everyone switch to the January financial report and go to the reserve fund summary. And once again, this is being impacted by budget amendment 2 as well. But to Todd's question, Todd, we had discussion, I think it was last.
What page is that? Is that
Page
amendment?
11,
one.
page 11.
Attachment 1.
Page 11.
Page 11.
It's page 11 of the whole packet. This time I actually was smart enough and just page numbered everything. So if you, to Todd's question, so Todd, I think we had some discussion last year about, and we've made some changes since I've been here, about what is considered an appropriate reserve.
I think that's
So-
where Phil is going to,
Right,
right?
so,
That's the-
so there's the Government Finance Officers Association and the group that's more tenured, I mean, I think this predates Lisa even. You know, basically has sort of a threshold of what you should do from an operating reserve. And that's, Todd, what the $250,000 is, that's set aside. That's a very large operating reserve, so that is something, you know.
But we just put it in the capital
Yeah,
plan.
but the operating
that's
reserve.
a-
the
So
operating
that's a
reserve
separate
doesn't get
fund.
touched,
Oh,
yeah.
Okay, all right.
So-
Do we have investments
We, oh,
on the
lots,
side?
lots of investments, yeah.
No, I mean, like a bank account with,
Oh, yeah.
I don't know,
Yeah, I mean, basically.
bonds or something?
You mean revenue, a source of revenue?
A savings plan that if we need to top, I mean, if we need extra, there's no side endowment here.
Well, there's investments. So basically, you know, we analyze our cash flows
Mutual
and
funds.
yeah, you can't do that in government. So basically what we're invested in right now is, because Mary and I just,
CDs.
we're in
CD,
CD, we're in
okay.
CDs, we have a savings account and we participate in the Montgomery County Investment Pool, which has been yielding. So we basically look at our cash flows, look at when projects are likely to happen. We're about to move a big chunk of change to the Montgomery County Investment
Okay.
Pool because we had really good luck with
Is
that.
there funds besides these that are used,
Yeah.
or is it just
I
when we're
think,
not using this, we put it in there? and-
correct. I think the way to look at this, and even these funds, Todd, are invested. What the
Okay.
reserve fund summary basically says is we have self-restrict, well, I mean, in some cases, highway user is not self-restricted, we have to do it, but think of the reserve as almost a self-restriction of funds or a
Okay.
legally required restriction of funds. That's a whole different thing than cash management and investments. So those are basically taking your idle cash, if you will.
Right,
And generating a little revenue for
Correct.
on
them.
the side.
Right.
okay. And so this, I'm sorry.
No.
Yeah. So this is the amount that we have decided we want to set aside,
Right.
but we don't have in the charter or anywhere else some sort of statement about how much we need to set aside?
There actually is. So, I can pull those up. Those were done a long time ago. I think,
Yeah.
Peter Benjamin, as many of you know, I think we broke Peter Benjamin and Jenny Kravanek quite a while ago. They dropped off. Peter basically was the lead financial guy for WMATA, for a number of years. WMATA,
WMATA, Metro.
Metro, both buses,
Oh,
rail,
sorry. Yeah.
everything.
And Ken Schwartz knows a lot about
He
budgeting too.
worked, he was, basically with, I think. he
Yeah,
worked with
the two of them,
Federal
right.
MB. But yeah, there are some policies that the town put in place. Obviously, one of the things going through budget amendment 2, and this was not a written policy, but just like the employee leave reserve, it's set way too high. So part of budget amendment 2, I'm sorry, you were not at the February meeting, but we're reducing that because we're over reserved. So that's freeing up money that can then be allocated to capital.
Okay.
Does that make sense, Tom?
Yeah.
But the 250 here is our rainy day fund.
100%.
The capital contingency is money
skip
that's
cost.
flexible for capital.
Right.
Okay, which we're just reallocating to decide where to.
Which
So
we
we're
could
perfect.
All right.
reallocate some of it.
Yeah.
Right, and where I was coming from was that if we have a cost overrun somewhere, we could go dip into the
Right.
contingency to finish it. The stuff that we see here, this 250 is either somewhat legally required or
Self-restricted.
self-restricted. We don't want to look at that. We just want to look, I'm talking about having a
Yep.
chunk of money, maybe it's 40 grand, I don't know, what it could be, whatever somebody wants to make.
Yeah.
Um,
I mean, I would say
to
due
dip
to,
into.
due to the nature, I mean, I think when you look at capital contingencies, some of that is driven by what you own. I've worked for a number of municipalities that have a lot of bridges, and quite frankly, that's the death knell. Because if something happens to a bridge, you're,
I can't wait.
you can't wait, you have to do it. We have roads, certainly there's the possibility of a sinkhole. Let's face it, we dodged a bullet with something with Penn Place that could have.
Yeah, it didn't blow up.
Yeah, yes.
Oh.
And certainly there's insurance and things like that, but, part of the idea is, I mean, you do have operational disruptions if your main headquarters blows up. I mean, you can have insurance, but you're gonna have to do
Well, there's
something pretty big.
deductibles, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
the deductibles are fairly low, that we have.
So what do you
Um,
recommend that we have for our capital contingency?
Where's capital contingency
That
on
could,
this page?
Separate
That's gonna
H6.
be, go
It's
to
not
the
here.
previous page, Lisa, on the, previous page, page 10.
Okay,
So that's about to be bumped up as we've been talking about. I would probably say, and this is just kind of more of a gut thing, then probably never less than $100,000.
What's it been in the past?
It's been like.
Well, it's less than 100,000 now.
Right
I
now, it's
mean,
74.
Right, but
So-
yeah, I mean, and that's gonna be conservative just because I think if you have a problem, it's likely to be with a road, it's likely to be with a building. But that's not a magic number. I mean, I think because it's just somehow with capital, it just feels better to me to have, around 100,000.
Okay,
It's
what do
only
y'all think of that?
it's like 5% of what we
Sounds
have
good.
now.
Yeah.
almost, right?
Yeah,
Okay.
Fine.
Okay, so, all right, I'm looking at the clock.
yeah, it is
and
getting
I'm
late.
Very much appreciative of how far we've come. But I also am aware of how much further there is to go.
Mhm.
And so I don't want us to just stop, but I want us to figure out what would be a good amount for us to, a good thing to accomplish before we adjourn for tonight and then have a plan for the rest.
If we adjourn tonight, there would be another meeting, is that?
Or,
Or-
I mean, we'd have to continue discussions, yes, we would, because we,
Sometime on our March agenda or.
Yeah,
Could we do that?
we could, I mean,
A good chunk of time?
we could, I'm. Caleb.
But we also
Caleb's
have that
just
early-
laughing 'cause I
we
have-
also have 6
I
o'clock
have to
meeting.
be in, I
Oh,
have
yeah.
to be in Rockville in court for the residents who sued us at 8 AM on on the day of the 11th. So I can hang in there. I'm actually planning to take the 12 off to recover. But yeah, I mean, I think what we can do, I sent Joanna the draft agenda. I don't think I was probably pretty generous with the times, Joanna, and I think certainly some of these, most of what's going to be on the agenda are adoption of the ordinances you considered last month. As Stephen is aware, HPC wanted an amendment to that section of the code, and that's drafted. I think Todd, you were going to basically spend a few minutes talking about what you envisioned for the charter.
Just to.
And Joanna and I had talked about maybe just having a very preliminary discussion about the gate at the end of Kenilworth, As you remember, she and I both had some residents approach us about that. So Claire put together some history from the minutes.
is that the gate in front of Jack Mandel's
Yes,
house? Oh,
yes.
my God.
So, you know, that the agenda is tentative. That could certainly come off, if you also deem, if you want to allocate, I know. That's Joanna.
Do you want to keep going tonight a little
I,
while?
I actually
would
have to
like-
drive to Annapolis because I've got the mayor's
Oh.
conference that starts at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. So
Oh.
So-
oh.
I'm just, but
Yeah.
I just don't know that we can get enough done.
Right, right.
I just-
Well, I just wanted to suggest, I'm not sure if us sitting here as a group trying to blank slate the capital budget makes sense. So
Right.
I was wondering if maybe we could ask, that Barb and Joanna and Kayla maybe come up with some proposals for us to react.
And
to.
questions.
Except that we're the one, you know, like, if we
Can-
want to base
Based
this on our
certain
priorities.
Right.
Can we spend a few minutes talking about it seems like there's 3 or 4 big things, one of which is the town hall, one of is the Cambria
Yeah.
park possibility,
We have
one
to
is
keep
the
the Yendel
stormwater, Yendel.
Yeah.
I mean, those are seem like the contending areas.
Well, Yendel, we have a source of funds.
Yeah, and
Part
so-
of the problem here is that we're mushing together the sources of funds and the uses of funds. So
Yeah.
it's very hard for me as a beginner at this to understand the bottom line of what it is we're actually, what the questions really are and what
Yeah,
the
isn't
financial
it-
Well,
impact
and
is.
it's to that point, and, you know, I'm trying not to overwhelm you, but you all are asking really good questions. So one of the things Mary and I talked about actually this week is, and, you know, and thankfully we have the cash flow to do it. I'm gonna double check, with my grants contact, at DNR, which is the state agency, Department of Natural Resources. So what's gonna happen with Yendel is we have to book the expenses because this is it's a reimbursement, to provide receipts. To keep things simple, if the state doesn't care, because, you know, we're not, you know, poor for money, I would rather just submit everything at the end of the project, and then get reimbursed. So I think as you look at Yendel, what you're seeing right now is the estimated kind of impact. I mean, we have to kind of adjust that to reflect what we anticipate the project to cost in total. Because right now what's showing is just what we were originally going to do if we didn't get any grant funding. But to Lisa's point, that number is going to go up because it's going to have to reflect the full project cost. But then there's
Okay.
almost $200,000 that's coming back.
So I would say we should net it out.
We can't,
Yes.
we can't, what we can do, and let me think about
For
how to do
discussion
that.
purposes.
Yeah.
Right.
So we go
I-
down to 450.
Right, you would not net it out from a budgetary standpoint.
Right.
Because you have to have it,
From a
but I
cash flow
can
standpoint.
basically, I'll
We get
try
it.
to play around between now and whenever,
Well, it'll be next year's budget. So now we go from 650 discretionary to 450,
right.
right?
So I think.
No, because then we'll get reimbursed, like that 200 will get reimbursed, so then we're gonna be back to having that.
What I'll do, and
Six-
Kayla, if you can help
Alright.
me, is I think the 2 areas where there is outside that we know of now, where there is kind of funding nuances. One is clearly Yendel, okay?
Right.
So we'll have to reflect the entire project cost in the budget, but I can show you something that says, okay, here's what we anticipated the full project cost. This is actually what will be the town's responsibility.
Right, net
Um,
of the other. source
Right,
of
so that you
funds,
can
right.
at
We
least
did that.
have that in the back of your mind. I think the other thing to keep in mind as you look at the streets and curbs and sidewalk numbers, one is I owe you the Clark Azar stuff. But keep in mind, like if you, by the end of this year, and it's not a huge sum of money, but you'll have $100,000 plus.
From the state.
That's highway user
Right.
revenue. That's
So they're
So
gonna
that's
get 50
where-
grand a
right.
year.
roughly
So
50,
it's
60 grand a
750
year.
now.
Yeah.
That we have to.
Right.
No, because highway user funds are
Oh,
restricted. They can
okay.
only go to.
Right, but I think as you look at those costs, yeah,
But it can go against
Yeah.
that cost.
yeah.
The missing thing that like that whole 35 account, like and we did this with SRTS and
Mhm.
kind of the same with ARPA, where it's kind of funding we're expecting to happen, but it's not necessarily our capital dollars spending it. I guess that's important probably to have at the bottom of this kind of worksheet chart. To
Yeah.
go, right? Because then we wouldn't have to worry about, we'd say, you know, if Yandel has 99,000 down there and we
Right.
expect it to be another 100 at the top, then we could
Yeah, I mean, I
not
think
have to worry about it.
the easy part for me to build out for you, I mean, and it sounds like, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, everyone's with some minor tweaks, you're reasonably comfortable with this format.
Yeah.
So should I feel free to start building it out? Because I
Yeah.
didn't.
Yeah, but
Yeah,
I
thank
think
you.
the sources of funds
Right.
have to be clear from the uses of funds.
And if
Yeah.
we're giving a prioritization to projects, it seems like we're left with only a few of them, in fact, for the 650. And so the question is, maybe we can just briefly discuss it is, how do we want to allocate? Right?
Yeah, I mean, what I would say that I
Just
know
3 or
of,
4 projects.
that's missing, that I'm aware of or incomplete is, I would say during this 5-year period, probably FY 2029, in terms of the community center, there's the playground. That's supposed to be by lease. It is a 50-50 split with the nursery school. I've had some discussions with them. I think they will be shocked at how much playgrounds actually cost. At the same time, what I said to Robin Daly is, we have a timing in mind and we put an application in for community parks and playground. I mean, I'm trying to remember, I think you can only, in that program, I'm trying to remember, sometimes they let you submit more than one application, but they force you to prioritize them.
So you're
Um,
saying that's,
There's another source of funds.
Right, there's a possible, I mean, it's a competitive process, but there's a possible different source of funds, and playgrounds are typically,
right,
when they're put out to bid, they are scaled. So you tell someone how much money you have, and you tell them what age group you're trying to serve, and you ask the bidders to basically give you examples of different playgrounds that could be constructed.
So are you suggesting that we put some money aside, knowing that for the community center, we're going to need
I would-
maybe $50,000?
Right, I would budget for a playground in FY 2029.
Uh-huh.
and how much do we budget for that?
I would say probably 50 grand. That may be on the low side. I mean, to put it in perspective, to replace what is at Cambria Park now, and that equipment's in good shape. They actually examined it when they came out to look at the playground surfacing issues. That's probably a $65,000 playground. But
Okay.
I don't think we'll be doing anything with the Cambria equipment in this
Okay.
5-year period.
So we're down to 600.
Well, you.
No, we
you
also have to get
take
rid of the
off
100
for the,
contingency.
Contingencies.
Oh, so we're
We're at
530.
500.
530.
You-
Well, but remember, you already have 75,000. I mean, you'll have enough money in capital contingency.
Well, yeah, but we
No, no,
start
but
out
we
with blank.
scrubbed it.
Oh, I see. Yes, you are.
Yeah.
Okay.
So how much do we have?
So
530?
we're at 530,
All
but
right.
so are there areas where we want to put a little bit like the community center where we know we're going to need 50 in a few years and we want to start saving that up? Or do we just want to talk about the big things like Cambria and storm drains?
And
Well,
town.
what
Yeah.
about the dog park? Is
That's
that
Cambria.
That's Cambria. I
Okay.
mean, I think you all have been talking about having another
Okay, so
discussion,
Cambria.
and I think it's gonna be very difficult for you to bring this to conclusion until you meet with the litigation firm on March 11th.
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, I just
Yeah.
think you could kind of spin yourselves around on that issue.
That's no way to guess.
You know, if I had any advice for you with some of the unknowns is and you have to obviously explain it to the community, is I would include in the CIP the things you know you are committed to. And where there's uncertainty, you build up the contingency account and you explain to residents why the contingency account is so high.
Can we agree to budget the funds that we need to do the assessment of the stormwater management system? Because I think that's a big
Yeah.
unknown. And
But
we
again-
think that's gonna be like $120,000.
That-
But isn't that money already in the operating side? The
No.
It's not in the
175?
operating
No.
side. We have
No.
storm drain accounts.
Yeah.
But it's better to wait until after the
Wait.
next.
Yeah, I would
discussion.
really wait, and I
Okay.
think, Joanna, do you feel like do you think, Joanna, it makes sense to try, I mean, you can look at the agenda after you get back from the conference. Obviously, I'm on vacation as of tomorrow anyway for a couple of days.
But whether, I feel like this is still kind of not,
Or do you feel like there
We
needs to
haven't
be more
nailed it
just?
down.
we haven't nailed it down enough to do that.
I think it's really illustrative though, because then it starts showing them there's not a lot of extra money down, and it's kind of like it forces the decision of either throw most of the eggs in the town hall basket and do very little elsewhere, or else
Well, we
moderate what you do on town hall.
also want to start the Cambria project and at least do an assessment, right?
Well, you gotta fix the pool wall first. You gotta do something
Yeah.
with that. So
You know what I think might be helpful, and, you know, I want to be cognizant of the fact that I'm not back to Monday night.
Are
I
you
think,
about to throw a flame and then walk away? Is that what you're gonna do?
no, what I was gonna say is, not at all. It usually doesn't bode well for people like me. When I get back, why don't I try to see if I can find a way to help you get your arms around this a little bit better. You know, and try to fill in the blanks where they're missing, where I know there's things that are coming up. So like I say, the community center, just kind of refining the IT, kind of, you know, clarifying things with Yendel.
But it-
You know, I think just what I would say is I do think because there's so much uncertainty surrounding certain things. And obviously, you know, I think this is what drove Ken crazy. The problem, I think, if you just put money in town hall and you haven't kind of thought through what your priorities are, from a community perspective, it's one thing to pull money out of town hall, I think has a whole different vibe that I would caution you against.
Right.
Yeah, we're also
Sure,
committing
it's
funds to
commitment.
move it forward.
But I
So
also,
Yeah,
but I also think I think we should spread out the cost of town hall. And if we're going to proceed with it as Plan 4,
I mean,
that we shouldn't bankrupt all the other priorities.
right. I
for
mean, I would
that, when
caution
it's
you
something
against
that
that.
will be used for another generation or more.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, budgeting is about balancing priorities because no one ever has enough money to do everything that they want.
all at once.
All at once, and no one ever has enough money ever, in my experience. You know, I can, you know, try to, like I say, fill in the missing pieces, you know, send some information to you. You know, I don't know, Joanna, whether or not, just given, you know, my being gone for a few days, if I can pull something together that would be helpful on March 11th, because I don't want to, you know, be disrespectful of your time either. I don't know if you think it would be helpful to have another work session sometime, Kayla.
I hope the town hall that days
Yeah, I was going to ask you if you'd have,
we are fighting up against it unless you all are committed enough to want to do a Friday afternoon or evening. A weekday evening session would only realistically be possible on March 26th and March 27th, which would give you some time after Laura returns and after the
I will say,
meeting with litigators to kind of.
yeah, what I will say is we could certainly do that. And I think that might be helpful.
Can it be in, we did it in town office one time years ago.
Did we? Okay.
Yeah,
Or
that wasn't even that long.
period,
I may be out of town. I'm
Yeah.
on
It's starting to get pretty tight between pulling things together for the April meeting for the actual budget adoption ordinance. And when push comes to shove, if I'm in a jam, I would put money into contingency.
So how about if you fill in more of what you know
Yeah.
is upcoming? So that we know what's our play money, so that the stuff, like the. And then we can each say, like, let's say the number is $300,000. And that can go toward a priority, and we can each individually consider where, you know, how do you want to split this? Do
Yeah.
you want it to all go toward Cambridge? Do you want it to all go toward
Town hall.
town hall? I mean,
But also
But-
conscious of the contingency that we don't want to put something in and then pull it out later.
right,
Right.
but if we can all just sort of say, okay, if I had $200,000 and I wanted to do something in town, what would I want that to be? And that way we can,
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right, Joanne. I think each of you having a sense of your individual priorities. I mean, what I would suggest for Cambria, you know, let's just say that remains a priority for you all to do something with that. If something goes into the CIP, you fund it, if that's what your priority is, and we apply for a grant.
Right.
Is the CIP binding? How binding is it?
Typically it is adopted as part of the budget as a, it is typically part of what I have seen in other jurisdictions adopted as part of a
But
budget.
it's a shifting plan.
We can move it.
Every budget
Change every year.
is flexible at your discretion because you have the, as a town council to amend it at any time you see fit.
Well, we don't, I guess my question is, do we even need to amend this? I would prefer this as an exercise document rather than something that we put into code.
except that if we are trying to be fiscally responsible and
Well-
plan ahead for things like roads that are on a regular cycle, then that's an important thing.
Here's what I was gonna say. So basically, once you adopt your operating budget, I mean, you have a capital budget now that has these available funds. Those funds have to be allocated somehow. So,
And then we have to tell the town what we're doing.
right. So
Right.
I would say, argue that the CIP is something, I mean, I've never seen it not adopted as part of a budget adoption ordinance. But,
We don't have to amend it with
you
votes.
can amend it at any time. I mean, yeah, I mean, I think if we, let's just, for argument's sake, you haven't had the opportunity to have the discussion, schedules down the line, and I take $500,000 and I bump up the contingency now because I'm not sure where you want to put it. You can then during the budget process, if you so choose,
Move the money.
move the money out to something.
Right.
I mean, what you will see in some, especially as you start getting out to out years. So when you think of a CIP, think of the FY 2025 in this instance. Whatever projects are sitting in FY 2025, you are choosing to fund by adopting the budget.
Okay,
As you get to the out years,
yeah,
it's a planning document.
that's what.
Right.
And what you
Yeah,
will see in a
building.
lot of places, if you don't have a dedicated funding source, like I say, let's say you have a grant that you know to replace a bridge, since I've used that example. What you will see in a lot of CIPs is they will actually, for out years, you'll see funded, unfunded. Because they're trying to sort of keep their planning document intact as far as keeping track of needs. But they're acknowledging that what they have currently exceeds available resources.
Right.
So you will see a lot of funded, like Rockville does it, for example, it's funded, unfunded. Because they don't want to lose track of it.
Or grants that have been applied for but not
Not
funded.
received, yeah.
So can I ask this group a question? Because I think it's important for Barb and Kayla to develop the budget. Are we planning, would our vote be to keep the tax rate the same?
That would be important to know.
Or do we want to reduce it or raise it or keep it
I don't
the
want to
same?
reduce. I don't think. I don't think.
I don't-
we're
Okay.
reducing or reducing.
Well, I'm just asking.
But
Yeah,
you
yes,
don't
of course.
increase, right?
But we don't have a particular need right now. I mean, if we increased it, it would only be to reduce the amount of money we would need
Yeah.
to borrow perhaps, and I don't think that that's.
Or amount of money that we would need to fund the bond if we were going to do
Yeah, the
that.
debt
But we could do that down the road.
Right.
I mean, we're not even going to ask for,
So
we
then-
wouldn't even ask for it for another year.
I'm just asking whether
Yeah.
Barb, we should keep the rate the same.
That will be important to know. I mean,
Yeah.
if you drop it, I mean, one, I would say it's a lot easier to maintain something, I'm just saying politically. but
Right.
Once you drop it, God help you when you try to take it back up again.
Well, the other thing is you said that if we just leave it flat right now, I mean, we leave the same number, we'll get a slight bump like.
Get a
11K
slight,
or something.
yeah,
Less than inflation.
it's not a lot, but, I
It's
think
around 11
The
grand.
point where it's going was to say, if we go to increase it above what we have now, we have to jump through some hoops, right?
Yeah, I mean, to give you an example, and the state gives you an estimate, that's what is, an estimated assessable base. They're factoring in possible protests and things like that happen. And sometimes, and this happened for this fiscal year, the assessable base estimate that the state had given me on February 14th of 2023, and what they're now saying it is, they've gone through the cycle, they've handled, they're making estimates on new additions, improvements to homes,
New
they're
houses.
calculating, new houses, or
Thank you.
tax protest. Right now, if you look at the current budgeted amount for real property tax revenue for FY 2024, the budgeted amount is roughly 638,000. This, based on the estimate that the state is saying, if we keep the tax rate the same, it's 649,000. So to Lisa's point, it's about $11,000.
Right.
Right.
So
But if
keeping
we
the
leave
rate
it
the
the
same doesn't do a lot for the town, but it's a marginal increase.
But we've also had a fair amount of rollover in the last couple of years.
We have.
And we will likely have a significant rollover that we're not
Yeah.
even taking into
Yeah,
consideration.
I think
because-
part of, I went back. and-
Rollover and ownership?
Rollover in
Oh,
funding. So I think a lot of as.
Money that we haven't expended.
I think when I went back
Okay.
and looked back a number of years when I first started, just trying to, I started my career in budgeting, so it's an interest. I think what was to a large extent, certainly income taxes, and I will never criticize anyone for, that drove a lot of the variances on the revenue side historically here, and it's a problem everywhere. Chevy Chase Village told me that they have had variances of $250,000 in a fiscal year on income taxes alone. The other thing I think though, on the other side of the ledger is I think, and I can appreciate why, I mean, you had Andrea and Elizabeth. And
As expenses, you mean?
no, Andrea and Elizabeth as the staff who could get projects done. So I think when you look back, Andrea was my predecessor. And Elizabeth, I don't.
Oh,
know.
Elizabeth.
Yeah, so those were the only staff members in the office. I think what was happening historically when I went back and tried to say, hey, why did we have this, increase in rollovers? I think the town was budgeting for projects that it simply did not have the staffing capacity to get done.
No
And-
doubt.
Yeah, so, Kayla's, we've been more solidly staffed. We've been able to get the tree work done. We've been able to do other things. So,
Well,
hopefully
also,
we'll see
those
some of.
rollovers coincided with COVID.
Right.
There was a major bandwidth ability to get
Well,
work done.
there
during
was,
COVID,
and
a couple of
during,
years
and
there.
during, for those of you who know Andrea had a baby during the
Right.
time she was here. We had an interim town
Staff
manager.
turnover.
So there's lots of, as I've often said to one of our residents who's interested in revenue, having variances in your budget are common, and you have to look at the reasons why they occurred. It doesn't always mean someone didn't do their job well. There's factors that can influence it, and staffing is certainly one of them.
Okay.
I did look at the past managers' reports, and the debt service was, I'm not quite sure why, but it was varying somewhere between 66,000 a year and $100,000 a year.
Because it's when you see the amortization schedules I'll send you, those are obviously samples, but you will see exactly why that happens.
But that's something for us to keep in mind. We're still getting not all of the rent that we always got in the past from Penn Place, but we're still getting black market and post office rent
Yeah.
for Penn Place without that debt service. So that is money that we're getting every
Right.
year in,
Well, and just as.
we can use for other purposes in
Yeah,
our
and
budget.
so there's not much negotiation with the US Postal Service, so that leaves us fixed. So that amount will stay flat. We are about to launch the renegotiation for Black Market because they've been there 20 years and the lease is ending.
Right.
Um,
Oh,
When I
good.
say that, I mean, the lack of the debt service.
Right.
Is essentially money freed up in our
Right,
budget
yeah.
to help us for some of these capital
Yeah,
projects.
so like I say, when you'll see on the amortization schedules is, you typically pay like 2 interest payments a year, but 1 principal payment. And so you'll just see on the right-hand column, when I send these to you, it'll just go through with all the assumptions and you'll just see how the debt service changes over time.
If we did a bond
Right,
issue,
right.
which we haven't decided. if
You have
we're
not,
doing.
but
No,
it'll
no.
give you an idea of why the
Right.
amounts will
Have we
vary.
decided that we're not gonna change the tax rate?
I think
Property
so.
tax rate?
That sounds like
it.
Sounds like
I
we
mean, it's
decided.
like something we should do an official vote for.
We
No,
will.
Which
But just informally.
Right.
We
I think
should
what you're
what?
saying-
What did you say? We
Yeah.
should do what?
At some point, maybe in our
Yeah.
next meeting, we should do an official vote for that, or as part of our budget process.
You'll see this,
Okay.
yeah, at this
Definitely.
point, based on what I'm hearing you say, I'm going to assume that both the real and personal property tax rates stay the same and base my budget estimates on that
Correct.
decision. You can obviously change it, but that's what I'll use as far as planning
Right.
purposes.
Steve, what were you gonna say?
But a comment and a question, I guess, one is the question was never answered when they changed the 2.045. Previous mayor wanted to change it and was never really clear.
Mhm.
She wanted
what
to
her
raise
rationale-
it?
I think she just wanted to change it from what a previous mayor had done, just for the sake of that, but, do we know how our tax rate compares to, like, if you had the same kind of a house in North Bethesda, then, like, are you paying more in
I
property
could-
tax here? Or
Yeah, I could
less?
probably, I can probably, I'm pretty sure. Yeah, I think I can get them from somebody I know at the county.
I was always
Or my
curious
other
if we-
question would be, have the other like towns increased their rates over the last 5 or 10 years?
Yeah, that.
Like,
might be a
where do
little
we
bit
stand in
Yeah,
that?
I mean, I will also say, and it's some of the Chevy Chases, and actually it's true of Gaithersburg. Gaithersburg has no property tax.
None?
No, Chevy Chase Village. No, I'm sorry. Gaithersburg, I think has that. They've never had any debt. Chevy Chase Village, I believe, has no real property tax rate. And what's going to happen, particularly depending on the demographics of the community, is in some of, I mean, if you can think about, and I'm just saying, because I know the people at Chevy Chase Village really well, and I know their CFO well. If you think of they're having at times a variance of $250,000 alone in income tax. If you're really income tax driven, which many of the Chevy Chases are, you will see that they will either have a very, very low property tax rate, or in some cases, 0 property tax rate.
So just continue
So
asking.
I think it's very difficult. You can look at what another city does.
But it's all over the place.
It's all over the place.
And Garrett Parkers aren't necessarily going to compare with other
No, I mean,
municipalities, I
sometimes you
guess.
do. I mean, I certainly have worked in communities and Tacoma Park being one of them where, get beaten about the head and shoulders about our property tax rate. And I think there's differences in services. So,
Right.
Tacoma Park has a full service police department. So it's very, you can look at the tax rates, but unless you dig in and you
It's
understand
not going to tell us.
where, yeah,
What is their tax rate, just out of curiosity?
I'm not sure what it is
Or whatever
anymore.
it was.
Rockville's was 29, when I was there, it was 29 cents and something.
But they have their-
Tacoma Parks was higher than that.
Somewhere we had.
Westminster's
somewhere we
higher
had a
than that.
chart that showed like, I think all the ones in the county and they varied a lot, but then like,
Yeah.
a lot of it had to do with
What's
a lot of other places have well, different services, but then other ones, they might have a lot of commercial ventures and we have what, one, right? So.
Is there, if we considered,
Black market.
I mean, we have a limit on commercial ventures, don't we?
Well, I mean,
we want that?
well, I mean, I think if you look at a Kensington, for example, I know you need, but I'm just saying, think about some of the jurisdictions that have commercial properties along Connecticut Avenue, and that stretches a whole lot of our, neighboring communities. Just think about what that means in the assessed value of a commercial building
Mhm.
versus not having it.
So there
So,
aren't a lot of places that are like Garrett Park.
yeah, I mean, I think if you're
Each of
interested
those.
just as an exercise, I can get it from the county, I think pretty
That's
easily.
okay.
But I don't think it's
you're
gonna,
right.
I don't think it's gonna
unless
help
really
you.
Delve into the services and what it
No, it's not
includes
gonna
in the
help you.
commercial and the
Um,
residential, it's not gonna mean
yeah.
anything.
I mean, I think part of it also is, besides just the commercial part, is on the residential side, what is the average assessed value of a home in
Right.
one jurisdiction versus another?
Right.
And that's gonna run the gamut throughout Montgomery County. I
So
can
the
tell you.
the question for us is if this is enough to work with.
Right.
I
that-
mean, I think
that is
there's
the
not, I
question.
don't think we've seen anything that shows that we're in dire straits or that we're so flush that we.
No,
No,
give
we're
back.
in-
So, I mean,
Yeah,
We're in
I
the
mean, it
line.
seems like
Right.
keeping it where it is makes a lot of sense.
And not having the $75,000 debt service for Penn Place should,
Yeah.
create some.
yeah, and I
bit of
can,
cushion.
well, that's been a few years though.
it's been a
Yeah,
couple
but-
years since we paid that, excuse me,
Okay.
since we paid that off. So,
So how about Barb, how about next week, you and I
yeah,
sort of flesh out some more, but in the meantime, if you all can think about, you had what's this amount of money that we want people to think of? You want it to be like 400,000? Or just like, think about where you want to allocate that in terms of putting money with your priorities.
In the capital budget.
In the capital budget. So if you have $400,000 as an individual, individual voting members, how do you want to fund the things that are most important to you with that money?
Yeah.
Just so that we can.
There's only 3 or 4 to choose from.
yeah, I mean, I
Right.
think yeah, I mean, I think what I've heard you talk about, I mean, there's the massive unknown about stormwater. There's Cambria, unless you all have some project that just hasn't come up in conversation. I think, then it's a matter of maintaining our equipment, maintaining our infrastructure such as, roads and sidewalks.
What
And
about the
town hall.
tramway?
Yeah,
Yeah.
What?
The tramway?
Yeah.
Over the
Oh, wait.
Porcupine Woods.
It's the carousel in the grotto.
But,
I got it.
there you go.
do we have the thing,
Monorail.
know that?
Yeah.
Are we going to do that this year?
The law?
Yeah, here's what Joanna and I have talked about this, but I haven't talked to the group about it. So when Jason was in town for something else, he and George and I went over and were looking at it. And this is a little bit different. I mean, I'll be honest with you, I'm behind because we just have a lot going on.
Sure.
I don't know if this is something, how you all feel about it, but one of the things we talked about is, and I think Stephen, you and Joanna had some discussion of something similar, I believe. But basically, if you're standing where the stairs come down at the pool, so you have the seated wall to the right, and then you have the starting to deteriorate
Right.
remnants of the cistern. One of the things we talked about, is not trying to avoid doing anything around that light fixture because that becomes very expensive. But to try to basically mirror that seated wall that's on the right,
The other side.
on the other side. So essentially what we would do is preserve what is there, but cover, basically just bury a good chunk of, I can send something to you that Jason
Yeah.
said is probably explaining it better, but so basically the wall remains there. It's not torn down. Leave a section if you're facing the cistern wall we're talking about, to the far right. Basically get a mason in and fix that up.
Right.
Put some kind of interpretive plaque on that section of the cistern wall explaining the history.
Mhm.
So it keeps it would add seating for one thing, which we think would be helpful. Maintains the wall, fixes up a part of it so it is still showing, but we're not trying to do the entire stretch of wall.
Sure.
Does that make sense? What I'm just-
It maintains it for some future in case we want to do something with it. We're not tearing it
Yeah,
down.
I don't remember off the top of my
Well,
head.
you can send it to me, I mean, I'd be interested in that, but
Yeah.
my main interest here was that we do, if we're gonna do something, it'd be nice to do it before the pool opens.
Yeah, so I
It
think,
doesn't give us a lot of time.
So is that part of the,
But then.
yeah, I mean, I think, and I'm not saying you should or shouldn't do it. I mean, we're kicking off options. Where things got left was that, and like I say, this falls on me, is we were to hire an architect who, and Stephen had a recommendation, and they look really qualified. It was Bell, I think, Stephen. To have someone come out and basically talk about what would be the appropriate historical way to basically restore the entire length of the wall. That is certainly an option.
Sure.
so how much would that cost?
If we do that, and that's what I'd like to pull the numbers out, because I revisited that with Jason recently. If that is the approach we go, what is currently as an unexpended balance, because there is funding, is insufficient.
Sure.
So I think the question is, and that was something that going that route was something that our own HPC recommended. The only reason nothing has moved forward.
Who is that?
Our own HPC, Historic Preservation Commission.
Okay.
They wanted to keep it versus.
Keep the wall.
Right.
Right.
But a way
Yeah.
to like, just
Yeah,
throw out a fake number of $100,000 to restore that. Rather than do that, what Barb is suggesting as an option that I actually support is bury it, not spend $100,000, but also not tear it down.
Yeah,
Just
so,
preserve the opportunity so in the future, if we want to have, if that is a priority.
And do some more seating on the other side?
yeah, so my understanding, and I have reached out to the pool association, is if you look at that seated wall, it is a retaining,
Yeah,
it is a
No, I
retaining
know
wall.
Right.
You know that, yeah, you know it really well,
And,
Phil. So the idea is to essentially
Carry it forward.
mirror that,
Right.
provide the support so it's no longer continuing to bow, but leave a part of it exposed, have a mason fix that up and do some interpretive signage. I've not talked to Nancy Waltz about this. It is a change from what HPC recommended. But I was trying to find a way to, if we went that route, it would be tight fill, but what we would probably do is do what we did for the community center. I don't know if DNF does this kind of work. I'm not trying to throw work at them, but someone who has a time and materials competitively awarded contract through the county. It would still need to come back to you all, but it probably would not be that big a job according to Jason.
And I'd like to get it just because I'd like to look at it. and
Yeah.
then I can.
He hasn't really done any drawings, but I can ask him if he can mock something up, but I think you get the
Sketch.
general idea. Yeah.
The basic
Sounds good.
concept would be you raise up the earth, you have less stress on the wall.
Right.
And you can fix it with less
Yeah.
complexity to how you gotta fix it. And
Yeah. And the seated wall, but just as it is on the other side, is a retaining wall supporting everything.
Well, the seat, because there's one issue, and this is the reason I wanted to see something, because there's
Mm-hmm.
one issue where as you move it, if you try to bury it and put a seating wall in front of it, you start running into an issue where you're cutting into the deck.
Yeah. And that was not the intention at all. But
Right.
we probably need, I mean, if there's,
What
if
deck?
you,
Maybe,
The pool.
can we
The pool
adjourn
deck.
and then discuss?
You
this
mean the
whoever wants to?
concrete deck?
Yeah.
Like, this is an-
let Joanna get back and she can adjourn, but what I would say is if this is something that you all at least are open to, what we probably need to do is get a structural engineer out.
What we do,
We had somebody, but have them, this is a different idea than we've talked about before. But Jason can either have them come out again, or if he doesn't, or you can talk through the person who you met. But in answer to your question, it depends whether there's enough money for this project depends on what methodology we use. If we go with what had been most recently discussed and was the direction I have been given, then the answer is no.
okay,
I can tell you that. So,
It doesn't have to be the exact same seat on the other side.
No, it
Could just
doesn't.
be could be a regular concrete retaining wall that is a seat, which is very common. And,
yeah,
you know, it could be something
yeah,
like this, where you've got the pool deck and then it slopes up, there's maybe 1.5 feet of wall exposed, but if you put that retaining wall here, that's a new concrete one by the pool, you fill that area in with earth, and that part of the tank that's left is much shorter.
Okay,
yes.
I gotta go, guys.
Yeah, Stevie,
So,
yeah, you want to?
What are we doing?
we're gonna adjourn.